Galaxy Audio presents Battlefield Earth, a saga of the year 3000 by L. Ron Hubbard.
Part 1, Chapter 1.
Man
Said Turl.
is an endangered species.
The hairy paws of the Chamco brothers hung suspended above the broad keys of the laser bash game. The cliffs of Char's eye bones drew down over his yellow orbs as he looked up in mystery. Even the steward, who had been padding quietly about, picking up her saucepans, lumbered to a halt and stared. Turl could not have produced a more profound effect had he thrown a meat girl naked into the middle of the room. The clear dome of the Intergalactic Mining Company Employee Recreation Hall shone black around and above them, silvered at its crossbars by the pale glow of the Earth's single moon, half full on this late summer night. Turl lifted his large, amber eyes from the tome that rested minutely in his massive claws and looked around the room. He was suddenly aware of the effect he had produced, and it amused him. Anything to relieve the humdrum monotony of a 10-year duty tour in this gods-abandoned mining camp, way out here on the edge of a minor galaxy. In an even more professorial voice, already deep and roaring enough, Turl repeated his thought.
Man is an endangered species.
Char glowered at him.
What in the name of diseased crap are you reading?
Turl did not much care for his tone. After all, Char was simply one of several mine managers, but Turl was chief of mine site security.
I didn't read it. I thought it.
You must have got it from somewhere.
Growled Char.
What is that book?
Turl held it up so Char could see its back. It said, General Report of Geological Mine Sites, Volume 250,369. Like all such books, it was huge, but printed on material that made it almost weightless, particularly on a low-gravity planet such as Earth. A triumph of design and manufacture that did not cut heavily into the payloads of freighters. Growled Char in disgust.
That must be 200-300 Earth years old. If you want to prowl around in books, I got an up-to-date General Board of Directors report that says we're 35 freighters behind in bauxite deliveries.
The Chamco brothers looked at each other, and then at their game to see where they had gotten to in shooting down the live mayflies in the airbox. But Turl's next words distracted them again.
Today,
Said Turl, brushing Char's push for work aside.
I got a sighting report from a recon drone that recorded only 35 men in that valley near that peak.
Turl waved his paw westward toward the towering mountain range silhouetted by the moon.
So?
Said Char.
So I dug up the books out of curiosity. There used to be hundreds in that valley. And furthermore,
Continued Turl with his professorial ways coming back.
there used to be thousands and thousands of them on this planet.
You can't believe all you read.
Said Char heavily.
On my last duty tour, it was Arcturus 4.
This book
Said Turl, lifting it impressively.
was compiled by the Culture and Ethnology Department of the Intergalactic Mining Company.
The larger Chamco brother batted his eyebones.
I didn't know we had one.
Char sniffed.
It was disbanded more than a century ago. Useless waste of money, yapping around about ecological impacts and junk like that.
He shifted his bulk around to Turl.
Truth exists, and what is done cannot be undone.
Freedom is slavery.
Is this some kind of scheme to explain a non-scheduled vacation? You're going to get your butt in a bind. I can see it. A pile of requisitions this high for breathe gas tanks and scout craft. You won't get any of my workers.
Turn off the juice. I only said that man...
I know what you said, but you got your appointment because you are clever. That's right. Clever. Not intelligent. Clever. And I can see right through an excuse to go on a hunting expedition. What Cyclo in his right skull would bother with the things?
The smaller Chamco brother grinned.
Yeah, I get tired of just dig, 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 ship, ship, ship. Hunting might be fun. I didn't think anybody did it for...
Char turned on him like a tank, zeroing in on its prey.
Fun hunting those things? You ever see one?
He lurched to his feet and the floor creaked. He put his paw just above his belt.
They only come up to here. They got hardly any hair on them except their heads. They're a dirty white color like a slug. They're so brittle, they break up when you try to put them in a pouch.
He snarled in disgust and picked up a saucepan of Kerbango.
They're so weak they couldn't pick this up without straining their guts, and they're not good eating.
He tossed off the Kerbango and made an earthquake shudder.
You ever see one?
Said the bigger Chamco brother. Char sat down. The dome rumbled, and he handed the empty saucepan to the steward.
No, not alive. I seen some bones in the shafts, and I heard.
There were thousands of them once.
Said Turl, ignoring the mine manager.
Thousands! All over the place.
Char belched.
Shouldn't wonder they die off. They breathe this oxygen-nitrogen air. Deadly stuff.
I got a crack in my face mask yesterday.
Said the smaller Chamco brother.
For about 30 seconds, I thought I wasn't going to make it. Bright lights bursting inside your skull. Deadly stuff. I really look forward to getting back home, where you can walk around without a suit or mask, where the gravity gives you something to push against, where everything is a beautiful purple, and there's not one bit of this green stuff. My papa used to tell me that if I wasn't a good cyclo, and if I didn't say sir, sir, sir to the right people, I'd wind up at a butt end of nowhere like this. He was right. I did. It's your shot, brother.
Char sat back and eyed Turl.
You ain't really going hunting for a man, are you?
Turl looked at his book. He inserted one of his talons to keep his place, and then thumped the volume against his knee.
I think you're wrong.
He mused.
There was something to these creatures. Before we came along, it says here, they had towns on every continent. They had flying machines and boats. They even appear to have fired off stuff into space.
How do you know that wasn't some other race?
Said Char.
How do you know it wasn't some lost colony of Cyclos?
No, it wasn't that. Cyclos can't breathe this air. It was man, all right, just like the cultural guys researched. And right in our own histories, you know how it says we got here?
Said Char.
Man apparently sent out some kind of probe that gave full directions to the place. Had pictures of man on it and everything. It got picked up by a Cyclo recon. And you know what?
Said Char.
The probe and the pictures were on a metal that was rare everywhere and worth a clanking fortune. And Intergalactic paid the Cyclo governor 60 trillion galactic credits for the directions and the concession. One gas barrage, and we were in business.
Fairy tales,
Said Char.
Every planet I ever helped gut has some button crap story like that, every one.
He yawned his face into a huge cavern.
All that was hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. You ever notice that the public relations department always puts their fairy tales so far back, nobody can ever check them?
I'm going to go out and catch one of these things.
Not with any of my crews or equipment, you ain't.
Turl heaved his mammoth bulk off the seat and crossed the creaking floor to the berthing hatch.
"You're as crazy as a nebula of crap,"
said Char. The two Chamco brothers got back into their game and intently laser blasted the entrapped mayflies into smoky puffs, one by one. Char looked at the empty door. The security chief knew no cyclo could go up into those mountains. Turl really was crazy. There was deadly uranium up there. But Turl, rumbling along a hallway to his room, did not consider himself crazy. He was being very clever, as always. He had started the rumors so no questions would get out of hand when he began to put into motion the personal plans that would make him wealthy and powerful and, almost as important, dig him out of this accursed planet. The man-things were the perfect answer. All he needed was just one, and then he could get the others. His campaign had begun, and begun very well, he thought. He went to sleep gloating over how clever he was. Part 1, Chapter 2. It was a good day for a funeral, only it seemed there wasn't going to be one. Dark, stormy-looking clouds were creeping in from the west, shredded by the snow-speckled peaks, leaving only a few patches of blue sky showing. Johnny Goodboy Tyler stood beside his horse at the upper end of the wide mountain meadow and looked with discontent upon the sprawled and decaying village. His father was dead, and he ought to be properly buried. He hadn't died of the red blotches, and there was no question of somebody else catching it. His bones had just crumbled away, so there was no excuse not to properly bury him. Yet there was no sign of anyone doing so. Johnny had gotten up in the dawn dark, determined to choke down his grief and go about his correct business. He had yelled up Wind Splitter, the fastest of his several horses, put a cowhide rope on his nose, and gone down through the dangerous defiles to the lower plain, and with a lot of hard riding and herding, pushed 5 wild cattle back up to the mountain meadow. He had then bashed out the brains of the fattest of them and ordered his Aunt Ellen to push the barbecue fire together and get meat cooking. Aunt Ellen hadn't cared for the orders. She had broken her sharpest rock, she said, and couldn't skin and cut the meat, and certain men hadn't dragged in any firewood lately. Johnny Goodboy had stood very tall and looked at her. Among people who were average height, Johnny Goodboy stood half a head taller, a muscular 6 feet shining with the bronzed health of his 20 years. He had just stood there, wind tangling his corn-yellow hair and beard, looking at her with his ice-blue eyes. And Aunt Ellen had gone and found some wood and had put a stone to work, even though it was a very dull one. He could see her now, down there below him, wrapped in the smoke of slow-roasting meat. Busy. There ought to be more activity in the village, Johnny thought. The last big funeral he had seen was when he was about 5 years old, when Smith, the mayor, had died. There had been songs and preaching and a feast, and it had ended with a dance by moonlight. Mayor Smith had been put in a hole in the ground and the dirt filled in over him, and while the 2 cross sticks of the marker were long since gone, it had been a proper, respectful funeral. More recently, they had just dumped the dead in the Black Rock Gulch below the water pool and let the coyotes clean them up. Well, that wasn't the way you went about it, Johnny told himself. Not with his father, anyway. He spun on his heel and with one motion went aboard Wind Splitter. The thump of his hard, bare heel sent the horse down toward the courthouse. He passed by the decayed ruins of cabins on the outskirts. Every year, they caved in further. For a long time, anybody needing a building log hadn't cut any trees. They had just stripped handy existing structures. But the logs in these cabins were so eaten up and rotted now, they hardly even served as firewood. Windsplitter picked his way down the weed-grown track, walking watchfully to avoid stepping on ancient and newly discarded food bones and trash. He twitched his ear toward a distant wolf howl from up in a mountain glen. The smell of new blood and the meat smoke must be pulling the wolves down, thought Johnny, and he hefted his kill club from where it dangled by a thong into his palm. He'd lately seen a wolf right down in the cabins, prowling around for bones, or maybe even a puppy, or a child. Even a decade ago, it wouldn't have happened. But every year, there were fewer and fewer people. Legend said that there had been 1,000 in the valley, but Johnny thought that was probably an exaggeration. There was plenty of food. The wide plains below the peaks were overrun with wild cattle, wild pigs, and bands of horses. The ranges above were alive with deer and goats, and even an unskilled hunter had no trouble getting food. There was plenty of water due to the melting snows and streams, and the little patches of vegetables would thrive if anybody planted and tended them. No, it wasn't food. It was something else. Animals reproduced, it seemed, but man didn't. At least not to any extent. The death rate and the birth rate were unbalanced, with death the winner. Even when children were born, they sometimes had only one eye, or one lung, or one hand, and had to be left out in the icy night. Monsters were unwanted things. All life was overpowered by a fear of monsters. Maybe it was this valley. When he was 7, he had asked his father about it.
But maybe people can't live in this place,
he had said. His father had looked at him wearily.
There were people in some other valleys, according to the legends. They're all gone, but there are still some of us.
He had not been convinced. Johnny had said,
"There's all those plains down there, and they're full of animals. Why don't we go live there?"
Johnny had always been a bit of a trial. Too smart, the elders had said. Always stirring things up. Questions, questions. And did he believe what he was told? Even by older men who knew a lot better? No, not Johnny Goodboy Tyler. But his father had not brought any of this up. He had just said wearily,
"There's no timber down there to build cabins."
This hadn't explained anything. So Johnny had said,
"I bet I could find something down there to build a cabin with."
His father had knelt down, patient for once, and said,
"You're a good boy, Johnny, and your mother and I love you very much. But nobody could build anything that would keep out the monsters."
Monsters. Monsters. All his life, Johnny had been hearing about the monsters. He'd never seen one. But he held his peace. The oldsters believed in monsters, so they believed in monsters. But thinking of his father brought an unwelcome wetness to his eyes. And he was almost unseated as his horse reared. A string of foot-long mountain rats had rushed headlong from a cabin and hit Windsplitter's legs. "What you get for dreaming," Johnny snapped to himself. He put Windsplitter's 4 hoofs back down on the path and drummed him forward the last few yards to the courthouse. Part 1, Chapter 3. Chrissy was standing there, her leg being hugged, as always, by her younger sister. Johnny Goodboy ignored her and looked at the courthouse. The old building was the only one to have a stone foundation and stone floor. Somebody had said it was 1,000 years old, and though Johnny didn't believe it, the place sure looked it. Even its 17th roof was as sway-backed as an overpacked horse. There wasn't a log in the upper structure that wasn't gaping with wormholes. The windows were mainly caved in like eye holes in a rotted skull. The stone walkway close to it was worn half a foot deep by the bare, horny feet of scores of generations of villagers coming here to be tried and punished in the olden days when somebody had cared. In his lifetime, Johnny had never seen a trial, or a town meeting for that matter.
Parson Staffer is inside,
said Chrissy. She was a slight girl, very pretty, about 18. She had large black eyes in strange contrast to her corn silk hair. She had wrapped around herself a doe skin really tight, and it showed her breasts and a lot of bare leg. Her little sister, Patty, a budding copy of the older girl, looked bright-eyed and interested.
Is there going to be a real funeral, Johnny?
Johnny didn't answer. He slid off Windsplitter in a graceful, single motion. He handed the lead rope to Patty, who ecstatically uncoiled herself from Chrissy's leg and snatched at it. At 7, Patty had no parents and little enough of a home, and her son rose and sat only on Johnny's proud orders.
Is there going to be meat and a burying in a hole in the ground and everything?
Demanded Patty. Johnny started through the courthouse door, paying no heed to the hand Chrissy put out to touch his arm. Parson Staffer lay sprawled on a mound of dirty grass, mouth open in snores, flies buzzing about. Johnny stirred him with his foot. Parson Staffer had seen better days. Once he had been fat and inclined to pomposity, but that was before he had begun to chew loco weed, to ease his toothaches, he said. He was gaunt now, dried up, nearly toothless, seamed with inlaid grime. Some wads of weed lay on the stones beside his moldy bed. As the toe prodded him again, Staffer opened his eyes and rubbed some of the scum out of them in alarm. Then he saw it was Johnny Goodboy Tyler.
Hey.
And he fell back without interest.
Get up,
said Johnny.
No, that's this generation,
muttered the parson.
No respect for their elders, rushing off to the bushes, fornicating, grabbing the best meat pieces.
Get up. You are going to give a funeral.
A funeral?
Moaned Staffer.
With meat and sermons and dancing.
Who is dead?
You know quite well who's dead. You were there at the end.
Oh, yes. Your father. Good man. Yes, good man. Well, maybe he was your father.
Johnny suddenly looked a little dangerous. He was standing there at ease, but he was wearing the skin of a puma that he himself had slain, and he had his kill club on a wrist thong. The club seemed to jump of its own volition into his palm. Parson Staffer abruptly sat up.
Now, don't take it wrong, Johnny. It's just that things are a little mixed up these days, you know. Your mother had 3 husbands one time and another. And there being no real ceremonies these days.
You better get up.
Staffer clawed for the corner of an ancient, scarred bench and pulled himself upright. He began to tie the deerskin he usually wore, and obviously had worn far too long, using a frayed woven grass rope.
My memory isn't so good these days, Johnny. One time I could remember all kinds of things. Legends, marriage ceremonies, hunt blessings, even family quarrels.
He was looking around for some fresh loco weed.
When the sun is straight up, you're going to call the whole village together at the old graveyard, and you're...
Who's gonna dig the hole? has to be a hole.
Were you or a loved one admitted to an Illinois behavioral health
funeral?
I'll dig the hole.
Staffer had found some fresh loco weed and began to gum it. He looked relieved.
Well, I'm glad the town doesn't have to dig the hole. Orange, but this stuff is green. You said meat. Who's gonna kill and cook it?
That's all taken care of.
Staffer nodded and then abruptly saw more work ahead.
Who's gonna assemble the people?
I'll ask Patty to tell them.
Staffer looked at him reproachfully.
Then there's nothing for me to do until straight up. Why'd you wake me up?
He threw himself back down on the dirty grass and sourly watched Johnny walk out of the ancient room. Part 1, Chapter 4. Johnny Goodboy sat with his knees to his chest, his arms wrapped around them, staring into the remains of the dance fire. Chrissy lay on her stomach beside him, idly shredding the seeds from a large sunflower between her very white teeth. She looked up at Johnny from time to time, a little puzzled, but not unduly so. She had never seen him cry before, even as a little boy. She knew he had loved his father, but Johnny was usually so tall and grand, even cold. Could it be that under that good-looking, almost pretty face, he felt emotions for her, too? It was something to speculate about. She knew very well how she felt about Johnny. If anything happened to Johnny, she would throw herself off the cliff where they sometimes herded wild cattle to their death. An easy way to kill them. Life without Johnny Goodboy would not only not be worth living, it would be completely unbearable. Maybe Johnny did care about her. The tears showed something. Patty had no such troubles. She had not only stuffed herself with roast meat, she had also stuffed herself with the wild strawberries that had been served by the heap. And then, during the dancing, she had run and run and run with 2 or 3 little boys, and then come back to eat some more. She was sleeping so heavily, she looked like a mound of rags. Johnny blamed himself. He had tried to tell his father, not just when he was 7, but many times thereafter, that something was wrong with this place. Places were not all the same. Johnny was sure of it. Why did the pigs and horses and cattle in the plains have little pigs and horses and cattle so numerously and so continuously? Yes, and why were there more and more wolves and coyotes and pumas and birds up in the higher ranges and fewer men? The villagers had been quite happy with the funeral, especially since Johnny and a couple of others had done most of the work. Johnny had not been happy with it at all. It wasn't good enough. They had gathered at sun straight up on the knoll above the village where some said the graveyard had been. The markers were all gone. Maybe it had been a graveyard. When Johnny had toiled, naked so as not to stain his puma skin cloak and doe breeches, in the morning sun, he had dug into something that might have been an old grave. At least there was a bone in it that could have been human. The villagers had come slouching around, and there had been a wait while Patty tore back to the courthouse and awakened Parson Staffer again. Only 25 of them had assembled. The others had said they were tired and asked for any food to be brought back to them. Then there had been an argument about the shape of the grave hole. Johnny had dug it oblong so the body could lie level. But when Staffer arrived, he said it should be straight up and down. The graves were dug straight up and down because you could get more bodies into a graveyard that way. When Johnny pointed out that there weren't any burials these days and there was plenty of room, Staffer told him off in front of everybody.
You're too smart,
Staffer rapped at him.
When we had even half a council, they used to remark on it. Every few council meetings, some prank of yours would come up. You'd ridden to the high ridge and killed a goat. You'd gone clear up High Peak and gotten lost in a blizzard. And found your way back, you said, by following the downslope of the ground. Too smart. Who else trained 6 horses? Everybody knows. Graves should be straight up and down.
But they had buried his father lying flat anyway, because nobody else had wanted to do more digging, and the sun was now past straight up, and it was getting hot. Johnny hadn't dared suggest what he really wanted to do. There would have been a riot. He had wanted to put his father in the cave of the ancient gods, far up at the top of the dark canyon, a savage cleft in the side of the tallest peak. When he was 12, he had strayed up there, more trying out a pony than going someplace. But the way up the canyon had been very flat and inviting. He had gone for miles and miles and miles, and then he had been abruptly halted by giant, vertical doors. They were of some kind of metal, heavily corroded. One couldn't see them from above or even from the canyon rims. They were absolutely huge. They went up and up. He had gotten off his pony and climbed over the rubble in front of them and simply stared. He had walked all around in circles and then come back and stared some more. After a while, he had gotten brave and had walked up to them, but push as he might, he couldn't open them. Then he had found a latch-like bar, and he had pried it off, and it fell, just missing his foot, rusted but very heavy. He had braced his shoulder against one door, sure that it was a door, and pushed, but his 12-year-old shoulder and weight hadn't had much effect on it. Then he had taken the fallen bar and begun to pry it into the slight crack, and after a few minutes he had gotten a purchase with it. There had been a horrible groaning sound that almost stood his hair up straight, and he dropped the bar and ran for the pony. Once he was mounted, his fright ebbed a bit. Maybe it was just a sound caused by the rusted hinges. Maybe it wasn't a monster. He had gone back and worked some more with the bar, and sure enough, it was just the door groaning on the pins that held it. An awful smell had come out of the cracked opening. The smell itself had made him afraid. A little light had been let in, and he peeked inside. A long flight of steps led down, remarkably even steps, and they would have been very neat except the steps were covered by skeletons, tumbled every which way. Skeletons in strips of clothing like he had never seen. Bits of metal, some bright, had fallen among the bones. He ran away again, but this time not as far as the pony. He had suddenly realized he would need proof. Bracing his nerve to a pitch he had seldom before achieved, he went back and gingerly stepped inside and picked up one of the bits of metal. It had a pretty design. A bird with flying wings holding arrows in its claws. Quite bright. His heart almost stopped when the skull he had removed it from tipped sideways and went to powder before his very gaze, as though it reproached him with its gaping eyes for his robbery and then expired. The pony had been in a white coat lather when he pulled up in the village. For 2 whole days, he said nothing, wondering how best to ask his questions. Previous experience in asking questions had made him cautious. Mayor Duncan was still alive at that time. Johnny had sat quietly beside him until the big man was properly stuffed with venison and was quiet except for a few belches.
That big tomb,
Johnny had said abruptly.
What big what?
Mayor Duncan had snorted.
The place up the dark canyon where they used to put the dead people.
What place?
Johnny had taken out the bright bird badge and shown it to Mayor Duncan. Duncan had looked at it, twisting his head this way and that, twisting the badge this way and that. Parson Stauffer, brighter in those days, had reached across the fire in a sudden swoop and grabbed the badge. The ensuing interrogation had not been pleasant. About young boys who went to places that were forbidden and got everybody in trouble and didn't listen at conferences where they had to learn legends and were too smart anyway. Mayor Duncan, however, had himself been curious and finally pinned Parson Staffer into recounting an applicable legend.
A tomb of the old gods,
the parson had finally said.
Nobody has been there in living memory. Small boys do not count. But it was said to exist by my great-grandfather when he was still alive, and he lived a long time. The gods used to come into these mountains, and they buried the great men in huge caverns. When the lightning flashed on High Peak, it was because the gods had come to bury a great man from over the water. Once, there were thousands and thousands living in big villages 100 times the size of this one. These villages were to the east, and it is said there is the remains of one straight east, where thousands lived. And the place was flat, except for some hills. And when a great man died there, the gods brought him to the tomb of the gods.
Parson Staffer had shaken the badge.
This was placed on the foreheads of the great when they were laid to rest in the great tomb of the gods. And that's what it is. And ancient law says that nobody is supposed to go there. And everybody had better stay away from there forever. Especially little boys.
And he had put the badge in his pouch. And that was the last Johnny ever saw of it. After all, Staffer was a holy man and in charge of holy things. Nevertheless, Johnny thought his father should have been buried in the tomb of the gods. Johnny had never been back there again and thought of it only when he saw lightning hit High Peak. But he wished he had buried his father there.
Are you worried?
Asked Chrissy. Johnny looked down at her, his reverie broken. The dying fire wove a reddish sheen into her hair and sparked in her dark eyes.
It's my fault,
said Johnny. Chrissy smiled and shook her head. Nothing could be Johnny's fault.
Yes, it is. There's something wrong with this place. My father's bones. In the last year, they just crumbled like that skeleton's in the Tomb of the Gods.
The Tomb of the what?
Said Chrissy, idly. If Johnny wanted to talk nonsense, it was all right with her. At least he was talking to her.
I should have buried him there. He was a great man. He taught me a lot of things. How to braid grass rope. How to wait for a puma to crouch before you stepped aside and hit him as he sprang. They can't turn in midair, you know. How to cut hide into strips.
Johnny, you aren't guilty of anything.
It was a bad funeral.
Johnny, it's the only funeral I remember.
No, it was not a good funeral. Staffer didn't preach a funeral sermon.
He talked. I didn't listen because I was helping gather strawberries, but I know he talked. Did he say something bad?
No, only it didn't apply.
Well, what did he say, Johnny?
Oh, you know, all that stuff about God being angry with the people. Everybody knows that legend. I can quote it myself.
Quote it.
Johnny sniffed a little impatiently, but she was interested and it made him feel a little better.
And then there came a day when God was wroth, and wearied he was of the fornicating and pleasure-dallying of the people. And he did cause a wondrous cloud to come, and everywhere it struck. The anger of God snuffed out the breath and breathing of 99 out of 100 men. And disaster lay upon the land, and plagues and epidemics rolled and smote the unholy. And when it was done, the wicked were gone, and only the holy and righteous, the true children of the Lord, remained upon the stark and bloodied field. But God even then was not sure, and so he tested them. He sent monsters upon them to drive them to the hills and secret places. And lo, the monsters hunted them and made them less and less, until at last all men remaining were the only holy, the only blessed, the only sure righteous upon earth. Amen!
Oh, that one. You say it very nicely, Johnny.
It's my fault,
said Johnny morosely.
I should have made my father listen. There is something wrong with this place. I am certain that if he had listened and we moved elsewhere, he would be alive today. I feel it.
Where else is there?
There's that whole great plain out there. Weeks of riding on it, I am sure. And they say man once lived in a big village out there.
Oh no, Johnny. The monsters.
I've never seen a monster.
You've seen the shiny flashing things that sail overhead every few days.
Ah, those. The sun and moon sail overhead too. So do the stars, and even shooting stars.
Chrissy was frightened suddenly.
Johnny, you're not going to do something.
I am. With first light, I am going to ride out and see if there really was a big village in the plains.
Chrissy felt her heart contract. She looked up at his determined profile. It was as though she was sinking down, down into the earth, as though she lay in today's grave.
Oh, please, Johnny.
No, I'm going.
Johnny, I'll go with you.
No, you stay here.
He thought fast, something to deter her.
I may be gone for a whole year.
Water got into her sight.
What will I do if you don't come back?
I'll come back.
Johnny, if you don't come back in a year, I'll come looking for you.
Johnny frowned. He scented blackmail.
Johnny, if you're leaving, you see those stars up there? When they come back to the same place next year and you haven't returned, I will come looking.
You'd be killed out in the plains. The pigs, the wild cattle.
Johnny, that is what I will do. I swear it, Johnny.
You think I'd just wander off and never return?
That's what I will do, Johnny. You can go, but that's what I will do.
Part 1, Chapter 5. The first dawn light was painting High Peak rose. It was going to be a beautiful day. Johnny Goodboy was completing the packing of a lead horse. Windsplitter was sidling about, biting at the grass, but not really eating. He had his eye on Johnny. They were obviously going somewhere, and Windsplitter was not going to be left out. Some wisps of smoke were coming from the breakfast fire of the Jimson family nearby. They were roasting a dog. Yesterday at the funeral feast, nearly a score of dogs had gotten into an idiot fight. There had been plenty of bones and meat as well, but the pack had gotten into a fight and a big brindle had been killed. Looked like the Jimson family would have meat all day. Johnny was trying to keep his mind on petty details and off Chrissy and Patty, who were standing there watching him quietly. Brown Limper Staffer was also there, idling about in the background. He had a club foot and should have been killed at birth. But he was the only child the Staffers had ever had, and Staffer was parson after all. Maybe mayor, too, since there wasn't any now. There was no affection whatever between Johnny and Brown Limper. During the funeral dancing, Brown had sat on the sidelines making sneering remarks about the dancing, about the funeral, about the meat, about the strawberries. But when he had made a remark about Johnny's father...
Maybe never had a bone in the right place.
Johnny had hit him a backhand cuff. Made Johnny ashamed of himself, hitting a cripple. Brown Limper stood crookedly, a faint blue bruise on his cheek, watching Johnny get ready, wishes of bad luck written all over him. Of similar age, there were only 5 in the whole village who were in their late teens, wandered up and asked Brown what was going on. Brown shrugged. Johnny kept his mind carefully on his business. He was probably taking too much, but he didn't know what he'd run into. Nobody knew. In the 2 buckskin sacks he was roping on either side of the lead horse, he had flintstones for fire, rats' nests for tinder, bundles of cut thongs, some sharp-edged rocks that were sometimes hard to find and cut indifferently well, 3 spare kill clubs, 1 heavy enough to crush a bear's skull, just in case, some warm robes that didn't stink very much, a couple of buckskins for spare clothes. He gave a start. He hadn't realized Chrissy had come within a foot of him. He hoped he wouldn't have to talk. Blackmail. That's what it was. Plain as possible and all bad. If she'd said she would kill herself if he didn't come back, well, one could have put that down to girl vaporings. But threatening to follow him in a year put another shadow on it entirely. It meant he would have to be cautious. He'd have to be careful not to get himself killed. It was one thing to worry about his own life. He didn't care a snap for risk or danger. But the thought of Chrissy going down on the plains if he didn't come back made him snow cold at the pit of his stomach. She'd be gored or mauled or eaten alive, and every agonizing second of it would be Johnny's fault. She had effectively committed him to caution and care, just what she intended. She was holding something out to him, 2 somethings. One was a large bone needle with a thong hole in it, and the other was a skin awl. Both were worn and polished and valuable.
They were Mama's,
said Chrissy.
I don't need anything.
No, you have them.
I won't need them.
If you lose your clothes,
she wailed.
How are you going to sew?
The crowd had thickened. Johnny didn't need any outbursts. He snatched the needle and awl out of her hand and unlashed the neck of a sack and dropped them in, made sure they hadn't missed and dropped out, and then relashed the sack. Chrissy stood more quietly. Johnny turned and faced her. He was a little bit shocked. There wasn't even a smudge of color in her face. She looked like she hadn't slept and had tick fever as well. Johnny's resolution wavered. Then beyond Chrissy, he saw Brown Limper tittering and talking behind his hand to Petey Tomso. Johnny's face went tight. He grabbed Chrissy and kissed her hard. It was as though he had taken a board from an irrigation trough. The tears went down her cheeks.
Now look, don't you follow me.
She made a careful effort to control her voice.
If you don't come back in a year, I will. By all the gods on High Peak, Johnny.
He looked at her. Then he beckoned to Windsplitter, who sidled over. With one smooth spring, he mounted, the lead rope of the other horse gripped in his hand.
You can have my other 4 horses,
said Johnny to Chrissy.
Don't eat them. They're trained.
He paused.
Unless you get awful hungry, of course, like in the winter.
Chrissy hung on to his leg for a moment, and then she stepped back and sagged. Johnny thumped Windsplitter with a heel, and they moved off. This was going to be no wild free ride to adventure. This was going to be a tiptoe scout with care. Chrissy had seen to that. At the entrance to the defile, he looked back. About 15 people were still standing there watching him go. They all looked dejected. He used a heel signal to make Windsplitter rear and waved his hand. They all waved back with sudden animation. Then Johnny was gone down the dark canyon trail to the wide and unknown plains. The rest of the people drifted off. Chrissy still stood there, hoping with a wild, crazy hope that he would ride into sight, returning. Patty tugged at her leg.
Chrissy, will he come back?
Chrissy's voice was very low. her eyes like ashes in a dead fire.
Goodbye,
she whispered. Part 1, Chapter 6. Turl belched. It was a polite way to attract attention, but the belch didn't make much impression through the whine and howl of machines in the transport department maintenance dome. Zip's concentration on his work became more marked. Mine Site 16's transport chief had little use for the security head. Every time a tool or a car or fuel turned up missing, or something was broken, it got attention from security. 3 crashed cars were strewn about in various stages of reassembly, one of them very messy with splotches of green cyclo blood in the interior upholstery. The big drills that dangled from the ceiling rails pointed sharp beaks this way and that, idling in their programming. Lathes with nothing in their jaws spun waiting for something to twist and shave. Belts snarled and slapped at each other. Turl watched the surprisingly nimble talons of Zit disassemble the small concentric shells of a high-speed jet engine. Turl had hoped to detect a small tremble or two in Zit's paws. If the transport chief's conscience was bothering him, it would be much easier to do business. There was no tremble. Zit finished the disassembly and threw the last ring on the bench. His yellow orbs contracted as he looked at Turl.
Well, what have I done now?
Turl lumbered closer and looked around.
Where are your maintenance men?
We're 15 mechanics under complement. They were transferred to operations over the last month. I know it and you know it. So why are you here?
As chief of security, Turl had learned through experience not to be very straightforward. If he simply asked for a manual reconnaissance plane, the transport chief would demand the emergency voucher, not get it, and say, no transport. And there were no emergencies for security on this dull planet. Not real ones. In hundreds of years of operation, there had not been the slightest security threat to intergalactic mining operations here. A dull security scene, and consequently the chief of that department was not considered very important. Apparent threats had to be manufactured with guile as their sole ingredient.
I've been investigating a suspicion of conspiracy to sabotage transport,
said Turl.
Kept me busy for the last 3 weeks.
He eased his bulk back against a wrecked car.
Don't lean on that recon. You'll dent its wing.
Turl decided it was better to be friendly and rumbled over to a stool at the bench where Zit was working.
Confidentially, Zit. I've had an idea that could get us some outside personnel. I'm working on it, and that's why I need a manual recon.
Zit batted his eye bones and sat down on another stool, which creaked despairingly under his 1,000-pound bulk.
This planet,
said Turl confidingly,
used to have a sentient race on it.
What race was that?
Asked Zit suspiciously.
Man.
Zit looked at him searchingly. A security officer was never noted for his sense of humor. Some had been known to bait and entrap, and then file charges. But Zit couldn't help himself. His mouth bones started to stretch, and even though he sought to control them, they spread, and suddenly his laugh exploded in Turl's face. Zit hastily got it under control and turned back to his bench to resume work.
Anything else on your mind?
Asked Zit, as an afterthought. This was not going well, thought Turl. Well, that's what happened when you were frank. It just didn't mix with security.
This suspicion of conspiracy to sabotage transport?
Said Turl, as he looked around at the wrecked cars with half-lowered eye bones.
Could reach to high places.
Zit threw down a wrench with a low snarl rumbled in him. He sat there, staring in front of him. He was thinking.
What do you really want?
He asked at last.
A recon plane. For 5 or 6 days.
Zit got up and yanked a transport schedule clipboard off the wall and studied it. He could hear Turl almost purring.
You see this schedule?
Said Zit, pushing it under Turl's nose.
Well, yes.
Do you see where it has 6 drone recons assigned to security?
Of course.
And do you see where this has been going on for?
Zit peeled back sheet after sheet.
Blast, for centuries, I suppose.
Have to keep a mine-site planet under surveillance,
said Turl complacently.
Under surveillance for what? Every scrap of ore was spotted and estimated long before your and my living memory. There's nothing out there but mammals, air organisms.
There might be a hostile landing.
Here?
Sneered Zit.
Company probes in outer space would detect it ages before it ever arrived here. Turl, transport has to fuel and maintain and recondition those drones 2 and 3 times a year. You know and I know the company is on an economy wave. Tell you what.
Turl waited sourly to be told.
If you will let us cancel those recon drones, I'll put a tri-wheel ground cycle at your disposal for a limited time.
Turl let out a small, shrill scream. Zit amended his bargain.
A ground car at your disposal when ordered.
Turl lumbered over to the crashed vehicle that had blood on its seats.
Wonder if this was caused by faulty maintenance.
Zit stood there, unrelenting. The crash had been caused by too much Kerbango on duty.
1 recon drone programmed to cover the whole planet, once a month. 1 ground car at your permanent disposal.
Turl looked at the other wrecks, but couldn't think of anything. These investigations were done and dead. Teach him to close investigations. He wandered back to Zit.
1 drone recon programmed to cover the whole planet once a month. 1 armored and firepower ground car at permanent disposal, with no questions on ammunition, breathe gas, or fuel requisitions.
Zit took the forms from the bench drawer and made them out. He shoved the papers and clipboard at Turl. As he signed, Turl thought to himself that this transport chief really ought to be looked into. Maybe for ore robbery. Zit took the papers back and removed from the switchboard the combination key card of the oldest and rattiest ground car that was gathering dust in the garage dome. He coupled it with a coupon book for ammo, another for breathe gas, and another for fuel. The deal would never actually become part of recorded history as a deal, for the dates of the orders were carefully not coincident. Neither suspected that they had just materially altered the future of the planet, and not for the better of Intergalactic. But that is sometimes the way with large commercial companies. When Turl had left to get his Mark II, armored, firepower, ground car, Zit thought to himself that it was wonderful what lies executives told just to be able to go hunting. Kill mad, they all were. Machine kill mad, too, from the jam-ups he had to repair. What a story. Man, a sentient race indeed. He laughed and got back to work. Part 1, Chapter 7. Johnny Goodboy Tyler galloped free across the vast ocean of grass, Windsplitter exuberantly stretching his legs, the lead horse rollicking along behind. What a day. Blue sky and the wind a cooling freshness on his face. Now 2 days out, he had come down from the mountains, through the foothills and into the vastest plain he had ever imagined. He could still see the tiniest tip of High Peak behind him, and with the sun it kept him true on course and reassured him that he could find his way home whenever he wanted. Total security. The herds of wild cattle were many, but he had been living with those all his life. A few wolves, but what were wolves? No bear, no puma so far. Why, in all reverence to the gods, did anybody ever stay cooped up in the mountains? And monsters. What monsters? Crazy tales. Even that shiny, floating cylinder that had gone overhead every few days the whole of his life was overdue down here. It had come from west to east with the regularity of every other heavenly body, but even it seemed to have stopped. On his present course, he would have seen it. In short, Johnny Goodboy Tyler was suffering from a bad case of overconfidence. And the first disaster that hit him had to do with pigs. Pigs were usually easy to kill, if you were a bit nimble and watched out for charges of the boars. And a small suckling pig was exactly what one could use for supper. Right there ahead of him, clear in the late afternoon light, was a compact herd of pigs out in the open. There were big ones and small ones, but they were all fat. Johnny pulled Windsplitter to a halt and slid off. The wind was not quite right, a bit too downwind to the pigs. They'd smell him if he approached directly. With a bent-knee run, he brought himself silently around them until the wind was at right angles. He stopped and hefted his club. The tall grass was nearly to his waist. The pigs were rooting around a shallow depression in the plain, where water stood in the wet months, making a temporary marsh. There must be roots to be had there, Johnny supposed. There were dozens of pigs, every one with his snout down. With a crouching gait, staying below the grass tops, Johnny went forward, closing the distance, yard by yard. Only a few feet separated him now from the outermost fringe of pigs. Silently he rose until his eyes were just above the level of the grass. A small porker was only 3 arm spans from him, an easy throw.
Here's for supper,
breathed Johnny, and heaved his kill club straight and true at the head of the pig. Dead on, a direct hit. The pig let out an ear splitter and dropped. But that wasn't all that happened. Instant confusion roared. Hidden from Johnny by the tall grass and slightly behind him and to his right, a 500-pound boar who had become tired of eating had lain down for a nap. The squeal of the hit pig acted like a whip on the whole herd, and away they went in an instant charge, straight upwind at Johnny's horses. For the big boar, to see was to charge. Johnny felt like he had been struck by a mountain avalanche. He was knocked flat and squashed in instants so close together they felt like one. He rolled, but the whole sky over him was filled with boar belly. He didn't see, but he sensed the teeth and tusks trying to find him. He rolled again, the savage squeals mixing with the roaring pound of the blood in his ears. Once more he rolled, and this time he saw daylight and a back. In the blink of an eye, he was on the boar's back. He reached an arm across the throat. The boar spun around and around like a bucking horse. Johnny's arm tightened until he could feel his sinews crack. And then the boar, strangled, dropped into a limp, jerking pile. Johnny unloaded quickly and backed up. The boar was gasping its breath back. It lurched to unsteady feet and, seeing no opponent, staggered off. Johnny went over and picked up the small pig, keeping an eye on the departing boar. But the boar, although it cast about and made small convulsive charges, still couldn't see anybody, and after a bit it trotted in the direction the herd had taken, following the trampled grass. There was no herd in sight, and there were no horses. No horses! Johnny stood there with the dead pig. He had no sharp rock to cut it, he had no flints to start a fire and roast it, and he had no horses. It might be worse. He looked at his legs, expecting to see tusk gashes.
Truth exists, and what is done cannot be undone.
Freedom is slavery.
Freedom is holding on to memory, to truth, to say 2 + 2 makes 4. From the age of Big Brother, from me, Winston Smith, greetings from 1984.
But he found none. His back and face ached a bit from the collision of the charge and his own collision with the ground, but that was all. Mentally kicking himself, more ashamed than scared, he made off in the direction of the trail of crushed grass. After a while, his depression wore off a bit, to be replaced by optimism. He began to whistle a call. The horses would not have just gone on running in front of the pigs. They would have veered off somewhere. Just as darkness was falling, he spotted Windsplitter, calmly cropping grass. The horse looked up with a, "Where have you been?" and then, with a plainly mischievous grin, as though he had intended to all the time, came over and bumped Johnny with his muzzle. It took another 10 minutes of anxious casting about to locate the lead horse and the packs. Johnny went back a short way to a little spring they'd passed and made camp. There he made himself a belt and a pouch, and into the latter he put tinder and a flint and some small sharp-edged stones. He put a stronger thong on the big kill club and fastened it to the belt. He wasn't going to be caught empty-handed a second time in this vast prairie. No, indeed. That night he dreamed of Chrissy being strangled by pigs, Chrissy mauled by bears, Chrissy crushed to a pulp under stampeding hoofs while he stood helpless in the sky where the spirits go, unable to do a damned thing. Part 1, Chapter 8. The great village, where thousands had lived, was obviously another one of those myths, like monsters. But he would look for it nonetheless. By the half-light of the yellowing dawn, Johnny was again trotting eastward. The plain was changing. There were some features about it that didn't seem usual, such as those mounds. Johnny detoured from his way into the sun to look at one of them. He stopped, leaning forward with a hand braced on Windsplitter's shoulder, to study the place. It was a little sort of hill, but it had a hole in the side, a rectangular hole. Otherwise, the mound was all covered with dirt and grass. Some freak of nature? A window opening? He slid off his horse and approached it. He walked around it. Then he paced it out. It was about 35 paces long and 10 paces wide. Ha! Maybe the mound was rectangular, too. An old, splintered stump stood to one side, and Johnny appropriated a jagged piece of it. He approached the window and, using the scrap of wood, began to push away the grass edges. It surprised him that he seemed to be digging not in earth, but in loose sand. When he got the lower part of the rectangle cleared, he could get right up to it and look into it. The mound was hollow. He backed up and looked at his horses and then around at the countryside. There wasn't anything menacing there. He bent over and started to crawl into the mound. And the window bit him. He straightened right up and looked at his wrist. It was bleeding. It wasn't a bad cut. It was that he was cut at all that startled him. Very carefully, he looked at the window. It had teeth. Well, maybe they weren't teeth. They were dull, bright, and had a lot of colors in them, and they stood all around the outside edges of the frame. He pulled one of them out. They were very loose. He took a bit of thong from his belt and tried it. Wonder of wonders. The tooth readily cut the thong, far better than the best rock edge. Hey, he thought, delighted. Look what I got. And with the greatest care, for the things did bite unless you were careful, he removed the splinters, big and small, from the frame and stacked them neatly. He went to his pack and got a piece of buckskin and wrapped them up. Valuable. You could cut and skin and scrape something wonderful with these things. Some kind of rock. Or this mound was the skull of some strange beast, and these were the remains of its teeth. Wonderful. When he had them all, and they were carefully stowed in his pack, except one nice bit he put in his belt pouch, he returned to the task of entering the mound. There was nothing to bite him now, and he climbed through the rectangle. There wasn't any pit. The level of the inside seemed to be a bit higher than the outside ground. A sudden flurry startled him half out of his wits. But it was just a bird that had a nest in here, and it left through the window with a rustle of wings. Once outside, it found a place to sit and began to scold and scold. Johnny fumbled his way through the dimness. There wasn't much there, mainly rust. But there had been things there. He could tell from the rust piles and wall marks. Walls? Yes, the place had walls. They were of some sort of rough stone or something, very evenly fitted together in big square blocks. Yes, these were walls. No animal made anything like this. And no animal made anything like this tray. It must have been part of something else, now turned to reddish powder. At the bottom of the powder were some circular discs, about as big as 3 thumbnails. And at the bottom of the pile of discs was one that was almost bright. Johnny picked it up and turned it over. He caught his breath. He moved over to the window where there was better light. There could be no mistake. It was the big bird with spread wings and arrows gripped in its claws. The same sign he had found in the tomb. He stood in quivering excitement for a bit, and then calmed down. He had it now. The mystery was solved, and he went back out the window and showed Windsplitter.
Godhouse,
said Johnny.
This is where they stayed while waiting to take great men up to the tomb. Pretty, isn't it?
Windsplitter finished chewing a mouthful of grass and gave Johnny a shove in the chest. It was time they were going. Johnny put the disc in his belt pouch. Well, it was no great village, but it proved definitely that there were things to find out here in the plains. Walls. Imagine that. Those gods could build walls. The bird stopped scolding in some relief as Johnny mounted up and moved away. It looked after the little cavalcade and then, with a couple more criticisms, went back inside the ancient ruin. Part 1, Chapter 9. Turl was as happy as a baby cyclo on a diet of straight kerbango. Although it was late in the day, he was on his way. He steered the Mark II ground car down the ramp, through the atmosphere port, and into the open air. There was a warning plaque on the ledge in front of the driver's seat. Battle readiness must be observed at all times. Although this tank is compression-contained, personal face masks and independent breathing systems must be kept in place. Personal and unauthorized battle use prohibited. Signed, Political Department, Intergalactic Mining Company, Vice Director Sot. Turl grinned at the sign. In the absence of political officers, on a planet where there was no indigenous politics, and in the absence of a war department, on a planet that had nothing to war against, the chief of security covered both those functions. That this old battle car existed on the planet at all meant that it must be very, very old, and in addition must have gotten there as a result of fixed allocations of vehicles to company stations. Clerks in Planet 1, Galaxy 1 offices were not always well advised when they wrote their endless directives and orders to the far-flung outposts of the commercial empire. Turl threw his personal face mask and tank onto the gunner's seat beside him and rubbed a thankful paw.
Wasn't sure what insurance I needed for my shop, so I hired an insurance medium. Property hazard.
Try simplybusiness.com. You can search, compare, and save on coverage in under 10 minutes.
Wow.
When it's time to insure, be sure. Simplybusiness.com.
Over his craggy face. What a lark. The old car ran like a well-greased digger. Small, not more than 30 feet long and 10 feet high, it skimmed above the ground like a low-flying wingless bird. Cunning mathematics had contoured it so that every exterior surface would make a hostile projectile glance off at an angle. Missile-proof glass slots gave a fine view of the terrain. Even the blast muzzles of its artillery were cleverly recessed. The interior upholstery, though worn and cracked in places, was a beautiful, soothing shade of purple. Turl felt good. He had 5 days of jet fuel and breathe gas and 5 days of rations in their 10-pound packs. He had cleaned up every scrap of paper in his baskets and had started no new emergencies. He had a borrowed shaft analysis pictorecorder that would take great pictures when put to other uses. And he was on his way. A break in the dull life of a security chief on a planet without insecurities. A planet that wasn't likely to produce many opportunities for an ambitious security chief to get promotion and advancement. It had been a gut blow when they ordered him to Earth. He wondered at once what he had done, whom he had accidentally insulted, whose bad side he had gotten on. But they assured him that none of these was the case. He was young. A cyclo had a lifespan of about 190 years, and Turl had been only 39 when he had been appointed. It was pointed out to him that few ever became security chiefs at such a tender age. It would show in his record that he had been one. And when he came back from the duty tour, they would see. Plums, like planets you could breathe on, went to older cyclos. He had not been fooled, really. Nobody in Security Personnel Pool, Planet 1, Galaxy 1, had wanted anything at all to do with this post. He could hear the future assignment interview now.
Last post, Earth. Where? Earth, Rimstar, 3rd planet, secondary galaxy 16. Oh. What did you accomplish on that post? It's all in the record. Yes, but there's nothing in the record. There must be something. Let me see it. No. Confidential company record.
And then the final horror.
Employee tell. It just happens that we have an opening in another Rimstar system. Galaxy 32. It's a quiet place. No indigenous life and no atmosphere at all.
Or even worse.
Employee Turl, Intergalactic has been dropping for some time on the exchange, and we have orders to economize. I'm afraid your record doesn't recommend continued employment. Don't call us, we'll call you.
He already had a bit of scribble on the wall. A month ago, he'd received word that his tour of duty had been extended, and there was no mention of his relief. A little bit of horror had touched him, a vision of a 190-year-old Turl tottering around on this same planet, long forgotten by friends and family, ending his days in a dome-crazy stupor, lowered into a slit-trench grave, and ticked off the roster by a clerk who kept the records neat, but didn't know a single face on them. Such questionable fates required action. Big action. There were better daydreams. Waiting in a big entrance hall, uniformed ushers at attention, but one of them whispering to another,
"Who's that?"
And the other,
"Don't you know? That's Turl."
And the big doors opening.
"The president of the company is waiting to thank you, sir. Please, come this way."
According to the mine surveys, there was an ancient highway to the north of here. Turl flipped the ground car onto auto and spread out a big map. There it was, running east and west was where he wanted to go. It would be busted up and overgrown, maybe even hard to spot, but it would have no steep grades, and it would run squarely up into the mountains. Turl had drawn a big circle around the target meadow. There was the highway ahead. He threw the controls to manual and fumbled a bit. He hadn't driven one of these things since security school years ago, and his uncertain control made the car yaw. He zoomed up the side embankment of the road and yanked back the throttles and pawed the brakes. The car slammed to earth in a geysering puff of dust, square in the center of the highway. It was a pretty jolting stop, but not bad. Not bad. He'd get better at it. He picked up his face mask and tank and donned them. Then he hit the decompression button so the tanks would recontain the breathe gas without waste. There was a momentary vacuum, a trifle uncomfortable on the hearing bones, and then with a sigh, the outside air entered the cab. Turl swung open the top hatch and stood up on the seat, the tank creaking and shuddering under his repositioned weight. The wind felt cool outside the borders of his face mask. He gazed around with some distaste. This sure was wide country, and empty. The only sound was the whisper of wind in the grass, and the sound of silence, vast silence. Even a far-off bird call made the silence heavier. The earth was tan and brown. The grass and occasional shrubs were green. The sky was an expansive blue, specked with white puffs of clouds. A strange country. People on home planet wouldn't believe it. No purple anywhere. With a sudden inspiration, Turl reached down into the car and grabbed the picto recorder. He aimed it in a sweeping circle, letting it grind away. He'd send his folks a spool of this. Then they'd believe him when he said it was one horn's awful of a planet, and maybe sympathize with him.
"My daily view,"
he said into the recorder as he finished the sweep. The words rumbled through his mask, sounding sad. There was something purple. Straight west, there were some mountains, and they looked purple. He put the picto recorder down and grinned at the mountains so far away. This was better than he thought. No wonder men lived up in the mountains. They were purple. Maybe the men were a bit sentient after all. He hoped so, but not with any great confidence. He was probably optimistic. But it gave some substance to his nebulous plans. Still looking westward, he suddenly caught sight of a landscape feature between himself and the mountains. A distant skyline silhouetted against the declining sun. He shifted a lever on his face mask glass to get magnification. The skyline leaped closer. Yes, he was right. There was a ruined city. Fuzzy and broken, but the buildings still very tall and quite extensive. The wind fluttered his mind map as he looked at it. The ancient highway ran straight west into it. Reaching down, he took a massive tome off the pile he had on the rear crew seat and opened it to a marked place. There was an insert drawing on the page. Some cultural artist had sketched it a few centuries ago. The company had used air-breathing chinkos for cultural posts on planets where there was air. The chinkos had come from Galaxy 2, beings as tall as cyclos, but thread-thin and delicate. They were an old race, and the cyclos didn't like to admit they had learned what they knew of cultural arts from them. But they had been easy to transport, despite breathing air and being feather-light, and they were cheap. Alas, they were no more, not even in Galaxy 2, having initiated a strike of all things. Intergalactic had wiped them out. But that was long after the culture and ethnology department had been terminated on Earth. Turl had never seen a Chinko. Remarkable beings, drawing pictures like this. Colorful, too. Why would anybody draw something?
People everywhere are
Aside from a bit of blunting and crumbling in the ensuing years, they were the same. The text said, "To eastward of the mountains lies the ruin of a man's city, remarkably well preserved. It was man called Denver. It is not as aesthetically advanced as those in the middle or eastern part of the continent. The usual miniature doors have little or no ornamentation. The interiors are no more than slightly oversized dollhouses. Utility rather than artistry seems to have been the overall architectural purpose. There are 3 cathedrals, which were apparently devoted to the worship of different heathen gods, showing that the culture was not monosectarian, even though it may have been dominated by priesthoods. One god, Bank, seems to have been more general in worship. There was a man library remarkably well stocked with books. The department sealed some of the library rooms after removing to archives the only important volumes, those on mining. As no ore bodies were evident under the foundations, and no valuable ore materials were employed by the indigenous population in its construction, the man city remains in a remarkable state of preservation, aided in part by the dry climate. The cost of further restoration is being requisitioned." Turl laughed to himself. No wonder the culture and ethnology department had been phased out on this planet if it was applying for credits to reconstruct man cities. He could hear the counterblast from the directors now. They'd fair put a shaft through the heads of such arty types. Well, it was data he might use in his plans. Who knew? He got back to the business at hand. There was the highway stretching out. He was right in the middle of it. It was a couple of 100 feet wide at this point, and it could be clearly discerned. It probably had 2 or 3 feet of sand on top of it, but the growing grass was uniform, and the shrubs to either side, not being able to put down roots directly on it, defined between their 2 edge rows a straight course. Turl took another look around. There were some cattle, a small herd of horses in the distance. Nothing worth shooting, since no cyclo could eat meat of that metabolism. Nothing dangerous enough to offer sport. It was luxurious to have time to think about hunting, and even to be equipped for it, and even more luxurious not to do it. He had a bigger game going anyway. He dropped down into the driver's seat and punched the buttons to close the top. The unbreathable air exhausted from the cab and was replaced by proper gas. He took off his face mask, contrary to regulations, and dropped it on the gunner's seat. The purple interior was a relief to his nerves. This confounded planet. It even looked bad through the purple tint of the windscreens. He glanced again at the map. Now was the time for some luck. He knew he couldn't go up into the mountains themselves due to the uranium the recon drones always indicated in that area. But the recon drones also reported that these man-things sometimes came down to the mountain foothills, which were safe enough. Turl thought over his plans again. They were beautiful plans. Personal wealth, personal power. The recon drones had told him more than others knew. The scans had pointed out a vein of almost solid gold, uncovered by a landslide after intergalactic surveys were finalized. A delicious, fabulously rich vein of gold in plain sight. A vein about which the company was ignorant, since the landslide was recent and Turl had destroyed the records. A joke on Zit to propose no more recon drones over the area. The uranium count in that area of the mountains was formidable, and so no cyclo could mine it. Even a few bits of uranium dust could explode cyclo-breathe gas. Turl smiled at his own genius. All he needed was a man-thing, and then a few more man-things. They could mine it, and to blast with uranium. Somehow he would get the gold off the planet and home, and he had ideas about how he could do that too. Then wealth and power, and no more of this place. All the security chief had to do was keep others from suspecting what he was really doing, to advertise quite other reasons. But Turl was an expert at that. If he were truly lucky, he could catch a man-thing this side of the meadow. He did not have too much time to lie in wait. He felt lucky. The sun was very low, thanks to his late start. He'd lie up in that man's city for the night, sleeping in the car. He sent the Mark II skimming along the ancient highway. Part 1, Chapter 10. A skyline!
Oh!
Johnny Goodboy Tyler pulled up with a yank so sudden he startled Windsplitter into a rear. There it was, straight east. It wasn't hills or mountains. It wasn't some trick of the eye. It was sharp and rectangular. He had been so unconvinced. When he had left the ancient ruin, he found a very easy way to travel. It was almost as if the ruin with the window had once had a broad path leading to it. There were shrubs on the right and shrubs on the left, 2 rows about 200 feet apart that dwindled eastward into the distance. Underfoot, there was fairly even grass. You had to watch it a bit because there were shallow gullies in places. When you looked down between these little gullies, there was something gray-white. Johnny had inspected it with care. He had gotten down and dug at the edges of such a crack, and it seemed that the gray-white stuff was continuous, just like the inner walls of the ruin. Maybe it was a wall of the ancients, fallen over sideways. But no, it would have cracked as it fell. Outside the courthouse, at home, level stones had been laid as pavement. But who wanted a pavement 200 feet wide and an hour's journey long? For what? This big path had not been used for a long time, if it was a path. It went between hillocks that had been sliced into, and it went across watercourses, although it was pretty irregular and broken in these. He had been excited for a while, but then he got used to it and devoted his attention mainly to keeping Windsplitter from tripping in the little gullies. When he was a little boy, one of the families had had a wheeled cart they hauled firewood in, and he had been told that once there had been a lot of carts, even one that was pulled by a mare. Well, you could sure roll a cart on this wide turf, and roll it fast and far. But as to the great village, he was coming to believe as the afternoon wore on that somebody had probably seen that god house back there and multiplied it in his imagination. And then, suddenly, there it was. But was it? He put Windsplitter up to a trot regardless of the little gullies. In the clear air, the skyline wasn't coming his way very fast. It even appeared to be receding. He stopped. Maybe it was a trick of the eye after all. But no, the lines it made were up and down and flat on top, and there was an awful lot of it. It wasn't hills or mountains. Only building sides could be that regular. He started up again, more sedately, remembering now to be careful. And after a while he could see that he was getting closer. The sun was coming down and he wasn't there yet. The prospect of entering that place in the dark was definitely not cheering. Who knew what it might be full of? Ghosts? Gods? People? Monsters? Ah, no. Not monsters. They were just the stuff mamas frightened their kids to sleep with. He pulled off the path where it crossed a stream and made camp. He warmed up some of his roasted pork and then cut it with one of the sharp, shiny things he had taken out of the window. My, he marveled. Imagine anything cutting like that. It would make... You had to watch it not to cut your own fingers, as he had already done twice, slightly. Maybe you could bed the cutting edge in wood or something for a handle. Then you would really have something. After supper, he built up his fire to keep the wolves off. A couple were sitting over there now, amber-eyed in the reflected firelight and looking hungry.
"Run away!"
shouted Johnny.
"Or I'll be wearing your hides!"
But the wolves just sat there. Windsplitter and the lead horse didn't want to go away from the fire. The wolves made them nervous. So Johnny picked up a couple of rocks, fist-sized, from the nearby stream bed. He wasn't interested in hunting wolves, but his horses had to find grass. He threw a pork bone about 10 feet beyond the fire and in the direction of the wolves. Big, rangy things they were. One slunk forward, belly low, snarling to reach the pork bone. In a moment, the wolf's attention would be fixed on the bone. Johnny's arm blurred. The far wolf caught the rock squarely between his eyes. Johnny's arm blurred again. The near wolf didn't jump in time, and he, too, was a dead wolf. Johnny said to Windsplitter,
"I gotta do all the work, is that it?"
And he walked over to the far wolf and hauled the carcass to the fire. Then he dragged the closer one in. Nope, neither one had a pelt worth taking at this time of the year. And they had ticks, too.
"Go on and eat,"
he told the horses. He built up the fire again, just in case the wolves had friends, and rolled up in his robes. Tomorrow was going to be the day. Part 1, Chapter 11. Johnny approached the great village cautiously. He was up before first light, and the yellow dawn found him in the outskirts of the place, peering, halting, looking closer at the strange sights. Nervous. Sand lay over everything, and grass and even scrub grew in the wide paths between the buildings. He gave a start every time a rabbit or a rat came tearing out of the ancient structures, disturbed by his footfalls. Even though the hoofs were muffled by the grass and sand, the silence of the place was so intense that any disturbance of it seemed overloud. He had never heard an echo before to notice it. The return of sound caused him a great deal of worry. For a little while he thought there must be another horse walking in the distance. But at last, He worked it out. He hit his wrist kill club against the one in his belt and promptly heard the same sound repeated softly, like a mockery. He waited, but no further mock occurred. Then he hit the clubs together again and the same sound returned. He decided it didn't happen unless he did it first. He looked about him. To both his left and his right were the tall remains of buildings, very tall indeed. Pitted by wind erosion, discolored by endless centuries of weather, they still stood flat and even and imposing. Astonishing. Whoever could build such things? Gods, perhaps? He eyed the massive size of the building blocks. No man could lift one by himself. Johnny sat his horse in the middle of what must have been the main path of the great village. He frowned, straining to comprehend the building of such a place. Many men? But how could they reach so high? He concentrated laboriously. Gradually he could conceive that if one built up steps of logs, and if many, many men put ropes around a block, and if they carried it up the steps, and then took the steps away, they might have done it. Marvelous, dizzy, and dangerous. But it was possible. Satisfied that it didn't need gods or monsters to have made this place, and therefore very relieved, he continued his exploration. He wondered whether some odd kind of tree had grown along this path. He got down and looked at the stump of one. It was hard and jagged. It had been hollow, and it was deep in the strange rock. It wasn't wood. It was a reddish metal, and when you scraped away the red powder, underneath was black. He looked up and down both sides of the wide path. The placing of these things was very precise. Although he couldn't figure out what they were for, it was obvious that, like buildings, they were placed objects. The innumerable windows surrounded him, seeming to stare back at him. The morning sun had come now, and it shone into those that faced it. Here and there were vast surfaces of the shiny stuff he had collected from the mound on the plain. It was not clear. It was whitish and bluish, like the cataracts on an old man's eyes. But there were whole sheets of it in some places. He began to realize it was some kind of covering, perhaps to keep out the cold and heat and yet let in light. People at home sometimes did that, using the tissue of animal stomachs. But those who had built the great village had access to some kind of rock or hard substance that came in sheets. They must have been very clever people. He saw a great yawning doorway ahead of him. The doors had fallen away and lay there half buried in the sand. The inside of the building gaped darkly. Johnny walked his horse through the door and looked about in the dimness. Debris was scattered all about, rotted and decayed beyond identification. But a waist-high series of platforms stood. They were of a remarkably white stone that had bluish veins in it. He leaned down from his horse and stared at the walls behind them. There were heavy, heavy doors set into it. 2 of them ajar, 1 of them wide open. Big wheels of still bright metal were inset into them. Johnny stepped to the platforms of white stone and dropped to the other side. Cautiously, he approached the open niche. There were shelves, and on the shelves, tangled with rotted remains of some kind of sacking, were mounds and mounds and mounds of discs. Some were a dull gray, almost tarnished away, but one pile was bright yellow. Johnny picked up a disc. It was as wide across as 2 fingernails and remarkably heavy. He turned it over and his eyes bugged. Here was that bird again. Talons gripping a bundle of arrows. Hastily he pawed into the other mounds, looking at disc after disc. Most of them had a bird on one side. The face of a man, the faces of different men, were on the other. Face of a man. And some of them had women on them. This was not a god symbol. This was a man symbol. The bird with the arrows belonged to man. The shock of it sent him reeling. He supported himself against the wall of the niche for minutes. He felt his head buzzing with the readjustment of ideas. These doors to the niches were man-made. The great village was man-made. The doors of the tomb in the mountains were of similar material, even if larger. The tomb was not a god tomb. The mound out on the plain was also man-made. Man had once built things. He was certain of it. And it would take many men to make this great village. Therefore, there must have been many men at one time. He rode his horse out of the place in a deep daze. His most basic ideas and values had suffered severe shifts, and it took a lot of getting used to. What legends were true? Which ones were false? There was the legend of the Great Village, and here it was. Man had obviously made it and had lived here in forgotten times. Maybe the legend of God getting angry with man and wiping him out was true, and maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had just been a big storm. He looked around the paths and buildings. There was no evidence of a storm. The buildings were still standing. Many even had that strange, thin sheeting in the windows. There were no bodies about, but from a time so long ago, bones would... He saw a structure that had its doors firmly closed and sheets of metal fastened where the windows should be. And looking closer, he saw that a huge metal clamp sealed the place. He got down and inspected the clamp. It was of a different age than the village. There was no tarnish on it at all. It was old, but not that old. Something or someone at some time had pushed aside the sand in front of the doors. It was grass-grown sand, but it had been disturbed. Johnny frowned. This building was not like the rest. It was in a fair state of preservation. Somebody had put metal sheets on the windows, and the metal was quite different from any in the rest of the town. It showed no signs of corrosion. Somebody had given this building special treatment. He backed up to get a better overall view. It was indeed a different kind of building, fewer windows, block solid. As an experienced tracker, Johnny studied the time differences here. Long, long after the village had been abandoned, somebody had made access to this place, made a path, even dug a path in and out of the doors, and then fastened the doors thoroughly. But even that had been a long time ago. Curious, he scanned the front facade. One of the metal window covers was loose. It was higher than his head, so he stood on his horse and pried at it. It gave a little bit. Encouraged, he shoved the handle of his kill club into the crack, and with a protesting whine, the cover suddenly sprang loose, startling Windsplitter, who moved off. Johnny held onto the ledge, his feet dangling. He pulled himself up. The transparent sheeting under the cover was still in place. He took his kill club and managed to hit it. The crash and tinkle of the stuff as it fell was shockingly loud in this quiet place. Experienced now with the cutting quality of this stuff, Johnny hung on to the ledge with one arm and cleaned up the jagged bits from one side of the frame and dusted off the ledge. He pulled himself through. The place was so dark that it took quite a while to see anything. Light was coming through in thin cracks where other windows remained covered. At length his eyes adjusted and he dropped cautiously down into the huge room. Now that he was not blocking the window's light, he could see quite well. Dust and sand were only a filmy cover over things. There were tables and tables and tables, and chairs and chairs and chairs, all marshaled in orderly rows. But they were not the interesting things. Almost every wall was covered with shelving. The stacks of shelves even protruded out into the room. Somebody had covered them with a sheeting you could see through. Something lay under the sheeting on every shelf. Johnny approached cautiously. He carefully removed the fastenings to the sheeting and looked behind it. Queer, thick rectangles stood on these shelves, rows of them. At first he thought it was all one piece, and then he found that one could remove a single rectangle. He took one off the shelf. It almost fell to pieces in his hands. Awkwardly, he juggled to hold it together, and then succeeded. What a strange object. It was a box that wasn't a box. The covers slid sideways away from each other, enclosing a packet of thin, remarkably thin, slices that had black marks on them. Lots of little, tiny black marks, all in orderly rows. What a strange object. How complicated. He put the first one back on the shelf and took a second, smaller one. It, too, fell open. Johnny found himself staring at a picture. It didn't have depth. At first, it seemed to, but his finger told him it was just a flat plane. The object there was a big red circle, much bigger than a strawberry, much smoother. It had a stem, and alongside it there was a black tent with a crossbar in the middle of it. He turned the sheet. There was a picture of a bee. No bee was ever that big, but this was certainly a bee. It too looked three-dimensional until his finger told him it wasn't, and a black thing beside it had two bulges on it. Johnny turned another sheet. There was a cat. A small cat, to be sure, but it was definitely a cat. And it had a curved black thing beside it like a new moon. A few pages later, there was a picture of a fox, and beside it was a black pole with two flags coming off it. Suddenly, a quiver went through Johnny. He held his breath. He grabbed the first object he had taken and pried it open again. There was the tent. There was the bee's black mark. Yes, and there was the pole with two flags. He held the two rectangles, his head in a whirl. He stared at them. There was a meaning here. Foxes, bees, cats, tents, bulges, new moons. These things had meanings in them. But about what? Animals? Weather? He could sort all that out later. He crowded the two rectangles into his belt pouch. Anything that was connected to weather and animals had value. Rectangles with meaning in them. The idea made bright lights pop in your skull. He replaced the protective sheet, went back out the window, replaced the metal covering as well as he could, and whistled Wind Splitter over, dropping down to the horse's back. Johnny looked around him expansively. Who knew what things of enormous value were in the great village? He felt rich, excited. There was no reason at all for his people to stay cooped up there in the mountains. Here was shelter and to spare. Here was firewood growing in the streets. Here were rooms and rooms and rooms. And come to think of it, he felt better since he'd been away from the mountain meadow. Better physically. And it hadn't taken a year, actually just a few days. He gathered up the lead rope of his pack horse, and they trotted briskly along the wide paths toward the eastern part of the great village. Although his eyes were busy taking it all in, his mind was engrossed in organizing a migration from the mountains down to this place. What he would have to pick up for evidence to convince them. What he was going to say to Staffer. How they could transport their goods. Maybe build a cart. Maybe there were carts right here in the great village. He could round up some horses. These piles of red dust he saw along either side of the wide paths from time to time might once have been carts of a sort. It was hard to figure out what shape they had really had. They were so caved in. The impression of a wheel, sheets of translucent rock. No, they hadn't been horse carts. Or had they? He began to look at such objects more closely. And then he saw the insect. Part 1, Chapter 12. It was very bright daylight now, and there it sat. There could be no mistaking it. Alien. Surely it must be an insect. Only cockroaches looked like that. Or beetles. No, cockroaches. But there were no cockroaches that big. Not 30 feet long and 10 feet high and maybe 12 feet side to side. A horrible brown color. And smooth. Johnny had stopped, the lead horse bunched up behind. The thing was sitting squarely in the middle of the wide path. It seemed to have 2 eyes in front, slitted. There was nothing like this on the plains or in the mountains, and he had seen nothing like it in the great village center. It looked new, with very little dust on it, and shiny. He felt it was alive. There was something about it. Yes, alive. Not inanimate metal, but a living thing. Then he saw what made him think so. There had been a slight rocking motion. Something moved behind the slitted eyes. Johnny, making no sudden movements, turned Windsplitter and pulling the lead horse began to move away in the direction from which he had approached. He had already noted that these paths were mostly rectangular and that you could go all the way around a group of buildings and come back to the same place. There was open country to the east, not very far. He would go down a side path and then circle back and get out into the plains. Hopefully, he could outrun it, if it moved. There was an ear-splitting roar. Johnny glanced back in terror. The thing rose to the ground. Dust flew from below it. It began to inch forward. It was alive. He put Windsplitter into a gallop, straight down the street. He passed one corner path, 2. The thing was falling behind. It was now 2 corners back. He swerved Windsplitter up a side path, yanking the lead horse with him. They reached another corner, and again he turned. Up ahead were 2 tall buildings. He'd keep going and reach the open country. He'd make it. And then suddenly there was a sheet of flame. Ahead of him, the right-hand building exploded apart. Its top slid slowly down and into the street ahead, blocking it. Spattered with dust, Johnny hauled up short. He could hear the roaring of the thing somewhere beyond the rubble. He listened, holding his breath. The position of the roar was changing. It was shifting to the right. He traced it with his ears. It was going on down the other street. Now it was level with him. Now it was getting behind him. The thing had somehow blocked the street ahead of him and then gone on, planning to come up behind him. He was trapped. Johnny looked at the smoking mound of fresh rubble ahead of him. It rose 20 feet above the pavement, a steep barricade. There was no panic in him now. He slowed the hard pounding of his heart. The thing to do was wait until the monster was right in the street behind him, then go over that barricade. He sidled Windsplitter back to get a good run. The thing was roaring down the side path behind him. Now it was turning. He glanced back. There it was, wisps of smoke coming out of its nostrils. Johnny put the heel to Windsplitter. He yanked on the lead rope. "Yeah!" shouted Johnny. The horses sprinted at the barricade, rough and full of loose stones, dangerous. Up they scrambled, rubble slid. Pray the gods no broken legs. Up they went. They hit the top. One glance back showed the thing rolling up to the very bottom of the barricade. Johnny sent the horses down in a turmoil of tumbling debris. They hit the street before them at a run and kept running. The walls racketed with the thunder of their run. Johnny swerved through a checkerboard of paths, edging to the open country. He could not hear the roaring thing now over the powerful thud of the running hoofs. Further and further. The buildings were thinning. He saw open country between 2 structures to his right and skidded down off the embankment and raced for freedom. As soon as he had free running space everywhere but toward the town, he slowed. Windsplitter and the lead horse were blowing and puffing.
It's okay.
He walked them until they caught their breath, casting his eyes restlessly up and down the edges of the town behind them. Then he caught the roaring again. He strained his eyes, watching. There it was. It slid out from among the buildings and started straight toward him. He put the horses up to a trot. The thing was closing the distance. He put the horses up to a run. The thing not only closed the distance, but started to pass him. Johnny swerved at right angles. The thing banked into a turn and flashed by him, went well ahead, turned, and blocked his way. Johnny pulled up. There it was, ugly, roaring, gleaming. He turned around and began to run away from it. It let out a blasting roar, scorched by him and again stopped, blocking his way. Johnny's face tightened into determination. He took his biggest kill club from his belt. He put the thong solidly on his wrist. He cast off the lead horse. Walking wind splitter, he went up ahead of the thing. It didn't move. He went about 100 feet in front of the thing. It didn't move. He carefully spotted the position of a slitted eye. He began to whirl the kill club. It swooshed in the air. He put a heel to wind splitter, and they raced straight at the thing. The kill club, carried with the full speed of the running horse, whooshed down straight at the slitted eye. The crash of impact was deafening. Johnny slowed beyond the thing. It had not moved. He trotted wind splitter back to the original position, 100 feet in front of the thing. He turned and made ready for a second run. The lead horse came up behind him to its habitual place. Johnny glanced at it and then back at the thing. He calculated the distance and the run to strike at the other slitted eye. He touched a heel. Wind splitter plunged forward. And then a great gout of yellow bloomed out from between the eyes. Johnny was struck a blow like all the winds of High Peak rolled into one. Wind splitter caught the full force of it. Up into the air went horse and rider. Down they came with a shuddering crash against the earth. Part 1, Chapter 13. Turl didn't know what he was looking at. He had bunked down in the car in the outskirts. He had the old Chinko map of the ancient city, but he had no curiosity about it. With a few shots of Kerbango, he had eased himself off into sleep, intending to be gone with the dawn, through the city and into the mountains. Senseless, even risky, to go on in the dark. The car, however, had grown hot with the morning sun before he awoke, and now he stared out at an odd thing in the street before him. Maybe it had been the footfalls that had awakened him. He didn't know what it was. He had seen horses. They were always falling down mine shafts. But he had never before seen a horse with 2 heads. That's right, 2 heads, one in front and one in the middle, and a second animal of similar sort behind. Only this one only had a second body in the middle, as if the second head was bent down out of sight. He batted his eye bones. He shifted over into the driver's seat and stared more intently through the armored windshield. The 2 beasts had now turned around and were walking the other way. So Turl started up and began to follow. It became apparent to him at once that the beasts knew he was after them. He took a hasty look at his ancient street map, thinking he could flash around a couple of blocks and head them off. But instead, it was the beasts who turned. Turl saw they would dead end and knew they would circle a block. It was elementary indeed to handle that. He glanced again at his map and spotted the right buildings to make a barricade. The firepower of the old Mark II was not very heavy, but it was surely enough for that. He adjusted the force lever with a fumbling and inexperienced paw and steered the tank into position. He hit the fire button. The resulting explosion was extremely satisfactory. A whole building tipped over to make a barricade. He jockeyed his throttle and wheeled around and went down the street, turned, and sure enough, there they were. He had his quarry trapped. Then he sat with slack jawbones to see the beasts go straight up over the smoking rubble and vanish from view. Turl sat there for a minute or two. Was this any part of what he was trying to accomplish? He was puzzled by the beasts, but they didn't have anything to do with the business he was in. Oh well, he had lots of time, and hunting was hunting after all. He pushed a button and fired off an antenna capsule, set to hover 300 feet up, and then turned on his picture screen. Sure enough, there were the beasts, tearing along, zigzagging around blocks. He watched their progress while he ate some breakfast. That done, he took a small shot of Kerbango, engaged the drivetrain, and following the picture was soon out in open country with his quarry in plain sight. He raced around in front and blocked them. They turned. He did it again. What were they? The second beast still had his head down, but the one in the lead definitely had two heads. Turl decided he had better not talk about this in the recreation room. They'd roast him. He watched with curiosity when the beast in the front stopped, took a stick out of his belt, and began a run at him. His curiosity turned to amazement. The thing was going to attack him. Incredible. The crash of the club against the windshield was deafening. His earbones rang with the assault. And that wasn't all. There was an immediate atmosphere sizzle. A wave of dizziness hit Turl. Bright lights popped in his skull. Air was getting into the cab. This old Mark II had seen better days. The supposedly armored windscreen had come loose in its mounts. Turl gaped at it in disbelief. The side gasket had given way. He panicked. Then his eye caught the sign about face masks, and he hastily snatched the mask and flask of breathe gas off the gunner's seat and snapped it over his face, opening the valve. He inhaled deeply, and the dizziness lessened. He took 3 deep breaths to clean the damned air out of his lungs. Turl stared anew at the strange beast. It was lining up for another run. His paws fumbled with the firepower. He wanted no recoil of the blast blowing back through the opened windscreen, and he pulled the force lever low to stun. He hoped it was enough. The beast started the run. Turl hit the fire button. It was enough, all right. The ions sizzled and glared. The beasts were slammed back, lifted clean off the ground. They fell. Turl watched intently to make sure they kept on lying where they had fallen. Good. They did. He let out a shuddering sigh into his mask, winding down. And then he sat up straight in new amazement. He had thought when they were hit that he was dealing with 2 four-legged beasts, but lying on the ground, they had come apart. Turl swung a side door wide and crawled out. He checked his belt gun and then rumbled over to the game he had hit. 3 beasts. Maybe 4. The 2 four-legged beasts were 2. On the one behind, a bundle of something had fallen apart. That maybe made 3. The nearer one definitely was 2 different beasts. What a confusion! He shook his head, trying to clear it. The effects of air were not wearing off fast enough. Little bright sparks were still popping in front of his eyes. He lumbered over to the more distant one, pushing the tall grass away. It was a horse. He had seen plenty of horses. The plains were full of them. But this horse had had a bundle tied on its back. Simple as that. The bundle had come loose. He kicked it. It wasn't anything alive, just some skins, some animal hides, and nonsense bits of other things. He walked back toward the tank through the high grass. The other thing was also a horse, and over to the right, where it had fallen clear, Turl pushed back the grass. Well, luck of the Gold Nebula. It was a man! The cyclo turned the man over. What a small, puny body. Hair on the face and head, but nowhere else. 2 arms, 2 legs, white-brown skin. Turl was unwilling to admit that Char's description fitted. In fact, he resented the fact that it did come close and promptly rejected it. The chest was moving, only slightly, true, but it was still alive. Turl felt fortunate indeed. His excursion was successful without his even going up into the mountains. He picked the man up with 1 paw and went back to the tank, throwing the man into the gunner's seat, which engulfed it. Then he set to work repairing the windscreen gasket with some permastick. The whole side of the glass had been dislodged, and although the glass itself was not even scratched, that had been quite a blow. He looked down at the small body swallowed in the seat. A fluke. It was the age of this tank, the brittleness of its gaskets. Sure was a ratty car. He'd find something wrong and put it in Zit's records. Misplaced parts, or something. He went over the other gaskets, the doors, and the other screen. They seemed all right, if brittle. Well, he wasn't going underwater, and there would surely be no more attacks from things like that. Turl stood up on the driver's seat and looked all around the horizon. All clear. No more of these beasts. He banged down the top and settled himself. His paw hit the compression change, and the hiss of air exhausting from the cab and the gurgle of breathe gas entering was welcome. His face mask was sweaty in the growing heat of the day, and he hated the thing. Oh, for a proper atmosphere planet. A planet with right gravity, with purple trees. The man thing went into a sudden convulsion. Turl drew back, alarmed. It was turning blue and jerking about. The last thing he wanted was a raving, mad animal inside the cab. Hastily, he adjusted his face mask, reversed the compression, and kicked open the side door. With 1 bat of his paw, he knocked the thing back out onto the grass. Turl sat there, watching it. He was afraid his plans were going up in a puff. The thing must have been more heavily affected by the stun blast than he knew. Crap, they were weak. He opened the cab top and looked over at one of the horses. He could see its sides moving. It was breathing and wasn't in any convulsion. It was even recovering. Well, a horse was a horse, and a man might be... He suddenly got it. The man thing couldn't breathe gas. The bluish color was fading. The convulsions had stopped. The chest was panting as the thing gulped in air. That gave Turl a problem. Blast if he was going to ride back to the mine site in a face mask. He got out of the car and went to the farther horse. It was recovering too. The sacks were lying near it. Turl rummaged through one and came up with some thongs. He went back and picked up the man thing and slammed it up on top of the car. He arranged it so its arms stuck out to each side. Tying piece after piece of thong together, he made a long rope. He tied one end to one wrist of the thing, passed the rope under the car, grunting a bit as he lifted it up to do so, and tied the other wrist. He yanked it good and tight. Then he pushed at the man thing experimentally to see whether it would fall off. Very good. He threw the sacks onto the gunner's seat and got in, closed up, and restarted the atmosphere change. The nearest horse was lifting its head, struggling to get up. Aside from surface blood boils caused by the stun gun, it seemed to be all right, which meant that the man thing would probably recover. Turl stretched his jawbones in a grin. Well, it was coming out all right, after all. He started up the car, turned it, and headed back toward the mine site. Part 2, Chapter 1. Turl was all efficiency. great plans bubbling in his cavernous skull. The old Chinkos had had a sort of zoo outside the compound, and despite the years that had intervened since the Chinkos were terminated here, the cages were still there. There was one in particular that was just right. It had a dirt floor and a cement pool, and netting of heavy mesh strung all around it. They had had some bears there that they said they were studying, and although the bears had died after a while, they had never escaped. Turl dumped the new beast into the cage. The thing was still only semi-conscious, getting over the shock of breathe gas, most likely. Turl looked at it lying there and then looked around. This had to be just right, all precautions taken. The cage door had a lock on it. It was open to the sky, and there was no netting over the top. What bear could climb a 30-foot set of bars? But there was a possibility that this new beast might tamper with the cage door. It wasn't probable, but the door didn't have a good lock on it. Turl had dumped the bags in the cage, having no place else to put them, and the long thong rope he had used was lying on the bags. He decided it would be wise to tie the beast up. He passed the thong around the neck of the thing and tied it there with a simple rigger knot and tied the other end to a bar. He stood back and checked things again. It was fine. He went out and closed the cage door. He'd have to put a better lock on it, but it would do just now. Satisfied with himself, garage, and went to his office. There was not much to do. A few dispatches, just forms, no emergencies. Turl finished up and sat back. What a dull place. Ah, well, he had started wheels rolling to get off it, to get back home. He decided he had better go out and see how the man thing was getting along. He picked up his breathe mask, put a new cartridge into it, and went out through the offices. There were a lot of empty desks these days. There were only 3 secretarial-type cyclos there, and they didn't pay much attention to him. Outside the compound, he reached the gate of the cage. He stopped, his eye bones rattling. The thing was clear over to the gate. He went in with a growl, picked the thing up, and put it into its original place. It had untied the knot. Turl looked at it. Plainly, it was terrified of him. And why not? It only came up to his belt buckle and was about 1/10 of his weight. Turl put the thong back around its neck. Being a mining company worker, accustomed to rigs and slings, Turl knew his knots. So this time he tied a double rigger knot. That would hold it. Cheerful once more, Turl went to the garage and got a water hose and began to wash down the Mark II. As he worked, he turned over various plans and approaches in his head. They all depended on that man thing out there. On a sudden hunch, he went back outside to look into the cage. The thing was standing inside the door. Turl crossly barged in, carried it back to its original position, and stared at the rope. It had untied a double rigger knot. With fast-working paws, Turl fixed that. He put the rope around its neck and tied it with a bucket hoist knot. The thing looked at him.
Why have you brought me here?
It was making some funny noises as if it could talk. Turl walked out, fastened the door, and got out of sight. He wasn't a security chief for nothing. From a vantage point behind a building, he levered his face mask glass to telephoto and observed. The thing, in no time at all, untied the complex bucket hoist knot. Turl rumbled back before it could get to the door. He went in, plucked the thing up, and put it back on the far side of the cage. He wound the rope around and around its neck, and then tied it with a double bucket knot so complex that only a veteran rigger could loosen it. Once more, he went off to an unseen distance. Again believing itself unobserved, what was the thing doing now? It reached into a pouch it was wearing, took out something bright, and cut the rope. Turl rumbled off to the garage and rummaged about through centuries of cast-offs and debris until he found a piece of flexi-rope, a welding torch, a welding power cartridge, and a short strip of metal. When he got back, the thing was over by the door again, trying to climb the 30-foot bars. Turl did a very thorough job. He made a collar out of the metal and welded it hotly around the neck. He welded the flexi-rope to the collar and welded the other end into a ring, hooking the ring over a bar 30 feet above the dirt floor of the cage. He stood back. The thing was grimacing and trying to hold the collar away from its neck, for it was still hot. That'll hold it, Turl told himself. But he hadn't finished. He wasn't a security chief for nothing. He went back to his office storeroom and broke out 2 button cameras, checked them, and switched them to the wavelength of his office viewer. Then he went back to the cage and put 1 button camera way up in the bars, pointing down, and put the other one out at a distance where it could view the exterior. The thing was pointing at its mouth and making sounds. Who knew what that meant? Only now did Turl feel relaxed. That night, he sat smugly in the employee recreation room, responding to no questions, quietly drinking his Kerbango in a very self-satisfied way. Part 2, Chapter 2. Johnny Goodboy Tyler stared in despair at his packs across the yard. The sun was hot. The collar on his burned neck hurt. His throat was parched with thirst, and he felt hungry. In those packs, just inside the cage door, there was a pig bladder of water. There was some cooked pork, if it hadn't spoiled, and there were hides he could rig for shade. At first, he had just been trying to get out. The very idea of being caged made him feel ill. Sicker even than the lack of water and food. It was all so unknown. The last he really remembered was starting to charge the insect and being blown into the air. Then this. No, wait. There was something after he was first stunned. He had started to come to, lying on something soft and smooth. He had seemed to be inside the insect. He had seen a huge something next to him. And then there was a sensation like breathing fire straight into his lungs that pulled every nerve short and threw him into a convulsion. There was another glimpse of an occurrence. He had flickeringly regained consciousness for a few moments. He seemed to be tied to the top of the insect, speeding across the plain. And then the back of his head bumped, and the next he knew, he was in here, in this cage. He put it together. He had hurt the insect, but not fatally. It had eaten him, but then spit him up. It had carried him on its back to its lair. But the real shock was the monster. It was true. He knew now that he had always been too smart. He had doubted his elders. He had doubted the great village, and there it had been. He had doubted the monsters, and here one was. When he had come to and found himself looking up at that thing, his head had reeled. He felt himself literally bending the bars behind him to get away. A monster! 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe more. About 3.5 feet wide. 2 arms, 2 legs, a shiny substance for a face, and a long tube from the chin down to the chest. Glowing amber eyes behind the shiny front plate. The ground shook as it approached. 1,000 pounds, maybe more. Huge booted feet dented the earth. And it had furry paws and long talons. He had been certain it was going to eat him right then, but it hadn't. It had tied him up like a dog. There was something strange about this monster's perceptions. Every time he'd tried to get untied and out of the cage, the monster had shown up again, as though it could see when it wasn't around to see. Possibly those little spheres had had something to do with it. The monster held them in its paws like small, detachable eyes. One was up there now, glittering way up in the corner of the cage, like a little eye. The other one was out there stuck onto a nearby building side. But the monster had caught him trying to get out before it planted those eyes. What was this place? There was a constant rumble from somewhere, a muted roar similar to the one the insect had made. The thought of more of those insects chilled him. There was a big stone basin in the middle of the cage, a few feet deep, with steps up one side. Lots of sand was in the bottom of it. A grave? A place to roast meat? No, there were no charred sticks or ashes in it. So there were monsters. When he stood in front of it, his face was just above the level of its belt buckle. Belt buckle? Yes, a shiny thing that held a belt together. It suddenly dawned on Johnny that the monster was wearing a covering that wasn't its own skin. A slippery, shiny, purple substance. It wasn't its own hide. Like clothes you'd cut out of a hide. Pants, a coat, a collar. It wore clothes. Ornaments on the collar. And a device was stamped on his mind's eye right now. It was a picture of ground on which stood small square blocks. Vertical shafts were going up from the square blocks. Out of the shafts seemed to be coming clouds of smoke. And smoke in curls lay all over the top of the picture. The idea of clouds of smoke stirred some memory in him, but he was too hungry and too thirsty and too hot to wrestle with it. The ground under him began to shake in measured tread. He knew what this was. The monster came to the door. It was carrying something. It came in and loomed over him. It threw down into the dirt some soft, gooey sticks of something. Then it just stood there. Johnny looked at the sticks. They weren't like anything he had ever seen. The monster made motions, pointing from the sticks to his face. That failing, the monster took up a stick and squashed it against Johnny's mouth, saying something in a rumbling, roaring voice. A command. Johnny got it. This was supposed to be food. He worked a bit of it around in his mouth and then swallowed it. Abruptly and immediately, he was violently ill. He felt like his whole stomach was going to rush back out of his mouth. Before he could control them, his limbs went into the beginning of a convulsion. He spat. Too thirsty to have much saliva, he tried to get rid of the stuff, all of it, every bit of it, every tiny piece of the acid taste of it. The monster just backed up and stood there staring at him.
Water!
Pleaded Johnny, getting control of his shaking limbs and voice.
Please! Water!
Anything to wash this horrible stuff out. He pointed to his mouth.
Water!
The monster just went on, standing there. The eyes back of the faceplate were slitted, glowing with an eerie fire. Johnny composed himself stoically. It was wrong to look weak and beg. There was such a thing as pride. He drew his face into stillness. The monster leaned over and checked the collar and the flexi rope, turned around and went back out, closed the gate with a firm clang, wired it shut, and left. The evening shadows were growing long. Johnny looked at his packs by the gate. They might as well be on the top of High Peak. A cloak of misery settled over him. He had to assume Windsplitter was gravely injured or dead. And he had to assume that in a few days, he himself probably would die of thirst or hunger. Twilight came. And then, with a shock, he realized Chrissy's promise to find him would wind up in her certain death. He caved in. The little bright eye, up in the corner of the cage, stared down unwinkingly. Part 2, Chapter 3. The following day, Turl probed around the disused quarters of the old Chinkos. It was unpleasant work. The quarters were outside the pressurized cyclodomes of the mine site, and he had to wear a breathe mask. The Chinkos were air breathers. And while the quarters had been sealed off, a few hundred years of neglect and weather leaks had left their marks. There were rows and rows of bookcases, lines and lines of filing cabinets full of notes, old scarred desks, rickety and frail to begin with, collapsing into themselves, piles of junk in lockers, and everything filmed over with white dust. Good thing he didn't have to breathe it. What funny beings the Chinkos had been. They were the intergalactic mining company's answer to some protests by more warlike and able worlds that mining was wrecking planetary ecologies. And the company being plush and profitable at that time, some knothead of a director in Intergalactic's main office had created the Culture and Ethnology Department, or C&E. Maybe it was originally named the Ecological Department, but Chinkos could paint. And some intergalactic director's wear-the-claws wife had begun to make a private fortune selling Chinko work on other planets and got the name changed. There was very little that didn't show up in the secret files of the security department. It was the strike the Chinkos had invented, not the corruption, that caused the final wipeout. Corruption at director level was very paws-off for security. A strike was not. But the Chinkos here had been gone long before that, and this place looked it. What, after all, was worth culturing on this planet? There weren't enough indigenous populations left to bother with, and who had cared anyway? But like any bureaucracy, the Chinkos had been busy. Look at those hundreds of yards of cabinets and books. Turl was looking for a manual on the feeding habits of man. Surely these busy Chinkos had studied that. He pawed and pawed. He opened and flipped hundreds of indexes. He got down and poked into lockers. And while he got a very good idea of what there was in these rambling offices and lockers, he couldn't find one single thing about what man ate. He found what bears ate. He found what mountain goats ate. He even found a treatise, scholarly composed, printed and reeking with wasted expense, on what some beast known as a whale ate. A treatise that ended up, laughably enough, with the fact that the beast was totally extinct. Turl stood in the middle of the place, disgusted. No wonder the company had phased out C&E on Earth. Imagine roaring around, burning up fuel, keeping a whole book manufacturing plant steaming like a digger's shovel, wearing out eyesight. It wasn't all in vain, though. He had learned from the aged and yellowed map he now gripped in his hand that there were a few other groups of men left on this planet. At least there had been a few hundred years ago. Some were in a place the Chinkos called Alps. Several dozen, in fact. There had been about 15 up in the ice belt the Chinkos called North Pole and Canada. There had been an unestimated number at a place called Scotland, and there had been some in Scandinavia, and also in a place called Colorado. This was the first time he had seen the Chinko name for this central mine site area, Colorado. He looked at the map with some amusement. Rocky Mountains, Pikes Peak, Funny Chinko names. The Chinkos always did their work in painfully severe cyclo, faithful to their ore. But they had had funny imaginations. This was getting him no place, however. Although it was good to know, for the sake of his planning, that there had been a few more men around. He would have to rely on what he should have relied on in the first place: security. The techniques of security. He would put them to work. He walked out and closed the door behind him and stared around at this non-cyclo-alien world. The old Chinko offices, barracks, and zoo were up on the high hill back of the mine site. Close by, but higher. The arrogant bastards. One could see all around from this place. One could see the ore transshipment platform as well as the freighter assembly field. The place didn't look very busy down there. Intergalactic would be sending some sizzlers down the line unless quotas were met. He hoped he wouldn't have too many investigations ordered by the Home Office. Blue sky, yellow sun, green trees, and the wind that tugged at him full of air. How he hated this place. The thought of staying made him grit his fangs. Well, what do you expect in an alien world? He'd finished that investigation ordered about a lost tractor, and then put his tried and true security technology to work on that man thing. That was the only way out of this hellhole. Part 2, Chapter 4. Johnny watched the monster. Thirsty, hungry, and with no hope. He felt adrift in a sea of unknowns. The thing had come into the cage, its footsteps shaking the earth, and had stood there for some time just looking at him. Small glints of light in its amber eyes. Then it had begun to putter around. Right now it was testing the bars, shaking them, apparently verifying that they were firm. Satisfied, it rumbled all around the perimeter, inspecting the dirt. It stood for a while, looking at the sticks it had tried to make Johnny eat. Johnny had pushed them as far away as possible since they had a bad, pungent smell. The monster counted them. Aha, it could count. It spent some time examining the collar and rope, and then it did a very strange thing. It unhooked the rope's far end from the bar top. Johnny held his breath. Maybe he could get to his packs. But the monster now hooked the rope on a nearby bar. He dropped a loop over the bar indifferently, and then moved off to the door. It spent some time at the door, rewinding the wires that kept it closed, and did not seem to notice that when it turned its back on the door, one of the wires sprang free. The monster rumbled off toward the compound and disappeared. Lightheaded with thirst and hunger, Johnny felt he was having delusions. He was afraid to hope. But there it was. The rope could be removed, and the gate fastening might be loose enough to open. He made very sure the monster was really gone. Then he acted. With a flip of the rope, he got the far end off the bar. Hastily, he wrapped the length around his body to get it out of his way and tucked the end into his belt. He dove for his packs. With shaking hands, he ripped them open. Some of his hope died. The water bladder had burst, probably from the earlier impact, and there was only dampness there. The pork, wrapped in hide that retained the sun's heat, was very spoiled, and he knew better than to eat it. He looked at the door. He would try. Grabbing a kill club and rope from the pack and checking his belt pouch for flints, Johnny crept to the door. No sign of the monster. The wires of the fastening were awfully big, but age had weakened them. Even so, they tore and bruised his hands as he feverishly sought to open them. Then they were open. He pushed against the door. In seconds, he was sprinting through the shrubs and gullies to the northwest. Keeping low, taking advantage of every bit of cover so as to remain hidden from the compound, he nevertheless went fast. He had to find water. His tongue was swollen, his lips cracked. He had to find food. He felt the light-headed unreality that came with the beginnings of starvation. Then he had to get back to the mountains. He had to stop Chrissy. Johnny went a mile. He examined his back trail. Nothing. He listened. No sound of the insect, no feel of monster feet shaking the earth. He ran 2 miles. He stopped and listened again. Still nothing. Hope flared within him. Ahead, he could see greenery, a patch jutting out of a gully, a sign of water. His breath hoarse and rattling in his chest, he made the edge of the gully. No scene could be more heartwarming. A speck of blue and white. The cheerful burble of a small brook running through the trees. Johnny lunged forward, and a moment later plunged his head into the incalculably precious water. He knew better than to drink too much. He just kept rinsing his mouth. For minutes he plunged his head and chest in and out of the stream, letting the water soak in. Gone was the taste of that terrible, gooey stick. The freshness and cleanness of the brook were almost as joyful as its wetness. He drank a few cautious swallows and then sank back, catching his breath. The day looked brighter. The back trail was still quiet. The monster might not discover he was gone for hours. Hope surged again. Far off to the northwest, just a little bit above the curve of the plain, were the mountains. Home. Johnny looked around him. There was an old rickety shack on the other side of the stream bed, the roof sunk down to its foundation. Food was his concern now. He took more swallows of water and stood up. He hefted his kill club and walked through the stream toward the ancient shack. While running, he had seen no game. Perhaps it was cleared out in the vicinity of the compound. But he didn't need big game. A rabbit would do. He had better take care of this fast and keep going. Something moved in the shack. He crept forward, silent. In a scurry, several big rats raced out of the shack. Johnny had started his throw and then stopped. Only in the dreariest of a starving winter would one eat rats. But he had no time and he saw no rabbits. He picked up a rock and threw it against the shack. 2 more rats streamed out and he threw his kill club straight and true. A moment later, he was holding a dead rat in his hand, a big one. Did he dare light a fire? No, no time for that. Raw rat? Ugh. He took a piece of the sharp, clear stuff from his pouch and stepped back to the stream. He cleaned and washed the rat. Hunger or no hunger, it took some doing to bite into the raw rat meat. Almost gagging, he chewed and swallowed. Well, it was food. He ate very slowly so that he wouldn't get any sicker than he felt at eating raw rat. Then he drank some more water. He wrapped a last piece of the rat in a scrap of hide and put it in his pouch. He kicked some sand over the debris he had left. He stood up straight and looked at the distant mountains. He took a deep breath, bracing himself to start again on his run. There was a low whistle in the air, and something fell over him. He rolled. It was a net. He couldn't get free. The more he tried to get out of it, the more tangled up he became. He stared wildly around. Through an opening, he saw the truth. The monster, without haste, was moving forward out of the trees, taking in the slack of the rope to which the net was attached. The thing exhibited no emotion. It moved as though it had all the time in the world. It wrapped Johnny up in the net and tucked the whole bundle under its arm, and then began to rumble along, back toward the compound. Part 2, Chapter 5. Turl, fiddling with forms at his desk, felt very tearful. Things were working out fine, just fine. Security techniques were always best, always. He now knew exactly what he had wanted to know. The thing drank water, and drank it by plunging its head and shoulders into a stream or pond. And more importantly, it ate raw rat. This made things very easy. If there was any animal available near the compound, it was rat. He guessed he could teach the old chinkos a thing or two. It was elementary to let the man-thing loose, and elementary to keep him under surveillance with a flying scope. It was, of course, a little trying to be out in the open wearing a breathe mask and yet make speed over the ground. That man-thing didn't run very fast compared to a cyclo, but it had been a bit of an exertion. It was hard to exert oneself while wearing a breathe mask. But he hadn't lost his skill in casting nets, old-fashioned though it might be. He hadn't wanted to use a stun gun again. The thing seemed frail and went into convulsions. Well, he was learning. He began to wonder how many raw rats a day the thing had to consume, but he could find that out easily. He looked before him. The lost tractor had been found along with its cyclo driver at the bottom of a 2-mile-deep mine shaft. They ate up a lot of personnel these days. There'd be a yowl from the main office about replacement costs. Then he cheered up. This fitted very well into his plans. He checked around to make sure he had no more work to do and put his desk in order for the end of day. Turl went over to a cabinet and took out the smallest blast gun he could find. He put a charge cartridge in it and set it to minimum power. He took some rags and cleaned up his face mask and put a new cartridge in it. Then he went outside. Not 100 yards north of the compound, he saw his first rat. With the accuracy that had won him an honored place on his school shoot team, even though the thing was in streaking motion, he blew its head off. 50 feet farther, another rat leaped out of a culvert and he decapitated it in midair. He paced off the distance. 42 cyclo paces. No, he hadn't lost his touch. Silly things to be hunting, but it still took a master's touch. 2. That would be good enough to start with. Turl looked around at the hateful day. Yellow, blue, and green. Well, he'd get quit of this. Feeling very cheerful, he rumbled up the hill to the old zoo. His mouth bones stretched in a grin. There was the man-thing crouched down at the far side of the cage, glaring at him. Glaring at him? Yes, it was true. It was the first time Turl had noticed it had emotions. And what else had it been doing? It had gotten to the packs. He remembered the thing clutching at them when he had returned it to the cage yesterday, and it was now sitting on them. It had been doing something else. It had been looking down at a couple of books. Books? Now where the crap nebula had it gotten books? Didn't seem possible it could have gotten into the old Chinko quarters. The collar, the rope were all secure. He'd investigate that in due course. The thing was still here, which was what was important. Turl advanced, smiling behind his mask. He held up the 2 dead rats and then tossed them to the man-thing. It didn't jump hungrily at them. It seemed to withdraw. Well, gratitude wasn't something you found in animals. No matter. Turl wasn't after gratitude from this thing. Turl went over to the old cement bear pool. It didn't seem to be cracked. He traced the piping. The piping seemed to be all right. He went outside the cage and fumbled around in the undergrowth, looking for the valves, and finally found one. He turned it. Hard to do with a valve that old. He was afraid his great strength would just twist the top off. From the nearby garage, he got some penetrating oil and went back and worked the valve over. Finally, he got it open. Nothing happened. Turl traced the old water system to a tank the Chinkos had built. He shook his head over the crudity of it. It had a pump, but the charge cartridge was long expended. He freed up the pump and put a new cartridge in it. Intergalactic was never one for innovations, thank the stars. The cartridges the pump needed were the same ones still in use. He got the pump whirring, but no water came. Finally, he found the pond. The old pipe was simply not in the water, so with one stamp of his boot, he put it back in. Up at the tank, the water began to run in, and down in the cage, the pool began to fill swiftly. Turl grinned to himself. A mining man could always handle fluids. And here, too, he hadn't lost his touch. He went back into the cage. The big center pool was filling rapidly. It was muddy and swirling since it had been full of sand, but it was wet water. The pool filled up to the top and slopped over, spilling across the floor of the cage. The man-thing was hastily picking up its things and jamming them into the bars to escape the inundation. Turl went back outside and shut off the valve. He let the tank on the hill fill and then shut that off. The cage was practically awash, but the water was draining off through the bars. Good enough. Turl slopped over to the man-thing. It was clinging to the bars to keep out of the water. It had the hides way up, jammed over the cross braces. To keep them dry? It was holding on to the books with one hand. Turl looked around. Everything was in order now, so he had better look into these books. He started to take them out of its hand, but it held on. With some impatience, Turl smashed at its wrist and caught the two books as they fell. They were man books. Puzzled, Turl leafed through them. Now where could this thing have picked up man books? He drew his eye bones together, thinking. Ah, the Chinko guidebook. There had been a library in that town. Well, maybe this animal had lived in that town. But books? This was better and better. Maybe, like the Chinkos had said, these animals could grasp meaning. Turl could not read the man characters, but they obviously were readable. The first one here must be a child's primer. The other one was some kind of child's story. Beginner books. The animal was looking stoically away in another direction. It was useless, of course, to try to talk to it. Turl halted his thought in mid-blink. Better and better for his plans. It had been talking. He remembered now. What he had thought were growls and squawks like you get from any animal had been reminiscent of words. And here were books. He made the thing look at him by turning its head. Turl pointed to the book and then at the thing's head. It gave no sign of understanding. Turl pushed the book up close to its face and pointed at its mouth. No sign of recognition occurred in the eyes. It either wasn't going to read or it couldn't read. He experimented some more. If these things could actually talk and read, then his plans were sure winners. He turned the pages in front of its face. No sign of recognition. But it had books in its possession. It had books, but it couldn't read. Maybe it had them for the pictures. Ah, success. Turl showed it a picture of a bee, and there was a flicker of interest and recognition. He showed it the picture of the fox, and again, that flick of recognition. He took the other book with pages of solid print. No sign of recognition. Got it. He put the small books in his breast pocket. Turl knew what to do. He knew every piece of everything in the old Chinko quarters, and that included man language discs. They had never written up what man ate, but they had gone to enormous trouble with man language. Typically Chinko. Miss the essentials and soar off into the stratosphere. He knew tomorrow's program. Better and better. Turl checked the collar, checked the rope, securely locked up the cage, and left. Part 2, Chapter 6. It had been a damp, cold, thoroughly miserable night. Johnny had clung to the bars for hours, loath to sit down or even step down. Mud was everywhere. The gush of water had taken the sand and dirt in the pool and spread it all over the cage, and the dirt of the floor had avidly soaked it up. The mud became ankle deep. But at last, exhausted, he had given in and slept lying in the mud. Mid-morning sun was drying it somewhat. The 2 dead rats had floated away out of reach, and Johnny didn't care. Already dehydrated from his previous experience, he felt the hot sun increase his thirst. He looked at the muddy pool, contaminated with slime from the cage. He could not bring himself.
We don't play favorites. We make custom-fit floor
to drink it. He was sitting miserably against the bars when the monster appeared. It stopped outside the door and looked in. It was carrying some metallic object in its paws. It looked at the mud, and for the moment, Johnny thought it might realize he couldn't go on sitting and sleeping in the mud. It went away. Just as Johnny believed it would not come back, it reappeared. This time it was still carrying the metal object, but it was also carrying a huge rickety table and an enormous chair. The thing made tricky work getting through the door with all that load, a door too small for it in the first place. But it came on in and put the table down. Then it put the metal object on the table. Johnny had at first believed that the huge chair was for him, but he was quickly disabused. The monster put the chair down at the side of the table and sat down on it. The legs of it sunk perilously into the mud. It indicated the mysterious object. Then it took the 2 books out of its pocket and threw them on the table. Johnny reached for them. He had not thought he would ever see them again, and he had begun to make out of them a kind of sense. The monster cuffed his hand and pointed at the object. It waved a paw across the top of the books in a kind of negative motion and pointed again at the object. There was a sack on the back of the object, and it had discs in it about the diameter of 2 hands. The monster took out one of the discs and looked at it. It had a hole in the middle with squiggles around it. The monster put the disc on top of the machine. There was a rod there that fitted into the middle of the disc. Johnny was extremely suspicious, his hand bruised from the cuff. Anything this monster was up to would be devious, treacherous, and dangerous. That had been adequately proved. The game was to bide one's time, watch and learn, and out of that possibly wrest freedom. The monster now pointed to 2 windows on the front of the object. Then it pointed to a single lever that stuck out from the front of it. The monster pushed the lever down. Johnny's eyes went round. He backed up. The object talked. Clear as a bell, it had said,
"Excuse me."
The monster pulled the lever up, and it stopped talking. Johnny drew back further. The monster clouded him between the shoulder blades and drove him up to the table so hard the edge hit his throat. The monster raised a cautionary finger at him. It shoved the lever up, and by standing on tiptoe, Johnny could see that the disc went backward from the way it had gone. The monster pulled the lever down again. The object said,
"Excuse me, but I am..."
The monster centered the lever, and the machine stopped. Then it pushed the lever up, and the machine went backward again. Johnny tried to look under the machine and back of it. The thing wasn't alive, surely. It didn't have ears or a nose or a mouth. Yes, it did have a mouth. A circle low down in front of it. But the mouth didn't move. Sound just came out of it. And it was talking Johnny's language. The monster pushed the lever down again, and the object said,
"Excuse me, but I am your..."
This time, Johnny saw that some odd squiggles had been showing up in the top window and a strange face in the lower window. Once more, the monster pushed the lever up, and the disc on top went backward. Then the monster centered the lever. It pointed a talon at Johnny's head, and then at the object. Johnny noticed then that the monster had been moving the lever off-center all positions to the left. The monster now moved the lever all the way over to the right and down, and different squiggles appeared, but the same picture showed. And the machine said something in some strange tongue. The monster backed it up and put the lever in the left, right, center, and down. Different squiggles, same lower picture, but an entirely different set of sounds. Behind the face mask, the monster seemed to smile. It repeated the last maneuver again and pointed to itself. Johnny suddenly understood that that was the monster's language. Johnny's interest was immediate, intense, and flaming. He reached up and pushed the monster's paw away. It was hard to reach because the table was so high and big, but Johnny made nothing of that. He moved the lever up and to the left. Then he moved it down. The machine said,
"Excuse me, but I am your instructor."
Then Johnny did the same operation in the right-hand position, and it said something that was language but strange. Then he did it in the center position, and it spoke again in the language of the Cyclos. The monster was looking at him closely, even suspiciously. It bent way over and peered back into Johnny's face. The flickering amber eyes slitted. Then it made a doubtful motion toward the machine as though it would pick it up and carry it off. Johnny slapped the huge hands away and fastened again on the lever. He put it in the left track and let it roll.
"Excuse me,
The machine said,
but I am your instructor, if you will forgive such arrogance. I do not have the honor to be a Cyclo. I am but a lowly Chinko."
The face in the bottom window bowed twice and put a hand over its eyes.
"I am Joga Stenko, Junior Assistant Language Slave in the Language Division of the Department of Culture and Ethnology, Planet Earth."
Squiggles were running rapidly in the upper window.
"Forgive my presumption, but this is a course of study in reading and speaking the man languages of English and Swedish. On the left-hand track of the record, I hope you will have no trouble in finding English. On the right-hand track, you will find the same text in Swedish. On the center track, the same text is in Cyclo, the noble language of conquerors. The written equivalent in each case appears in the upper window, and suitable pictures appear in the lower window. You will pardon my humble pretensions of learnedness. All wisdom abides in the governors of Cyclo, and one of their major companies, the great and mighty Intergalactic Mining Company, on which let there be profit."
Johnny centered the lever. He was breathing hard. The language was stilted, oddly pronounced, and many of the words he did not know. But he grasped it. He looked more closely at the object. He frowned, concentrating heavily. And then he grasped that it was a machine, a not live thing. That meant that the insect had been not live either. Johnny looked at the monster. Why was this thing doing this? What fresh dangers and privations did it have in mind? There was no kindness in those amber eyes. They were like a wolf's eyes seen in firelight. The monster pointed toward the machine, and Johnny pulled the lever down to the left.
"Excuse me,"
it said,
"but we will begin with the necessary alphabet. The first letter is A. Look at the upper window."
Johnny did, and saw the marks.
A, pronounced A. Its sound is also A as in pat, A as in pay, E as in care, A as in father. Look at it well. Excuse me, please, so you can always recognize it. The next letter of the alphabet is B. Look at the window. It always has the sound of B, as in bat.
The monster batted his hand up and opened the primer to the first page. It tapped a talon on A. Johnny had already made the connection. Language could be written and read, and this machine was going to teach him how to do it. He centered the lever and pulled it down, and there it was evidently spouting an alphabet in Cyclo. The little face in the lower window was showing mouth formations to say the sounds. He swung the lever over to the right, and it was saying an alphabet in Swedish? The monster stood up, looking the 4 feet down to Johnny. It took 2 dead rats from its pocket and dangled them in front of Johnny. What was this? A reward? It made Johnny feel like a dog being trained. He didn't take them. The monster made a sort of shrugging motion and said something. Johnny couldn't understand the words. But when the monster reached over to pick up the machine, he knew what they must have been. Something like, lessons over for the day. Johnny instantly pushed the arm.
You won't believe it.
Arms away from the machine. He moved over defiantly and stood there, blocking the reach. He wasn't sure what would happen if he'd be batted halfway across the cage, but he stood there. So did the monster. Head on one side, then the other. The monster roared. Johnny did not flinch. The monster roared some more, and Johnny divined, with relief, that it was laughing. The monster's belt buckle, showing the clouds of smoke in the sky, was a few inches below Johnny's eyes. It connected with the ancient legend that told of the end of Johnny's race. The laughter beat at Johnny's ears, a growling thunder of mockery. The monster turned around and went out, still laughing as it locked the gate. There was bitterness and determination on Johnny's face. He had to know more, much more. Then he could act. The machine was still on the table. Johnny reached for the lever. Part 2, Chapter 7. The summer heat dried out the mud. White clouds spotted the skies above the cage. But Johnny had no time for them. His whole concentration was on the teaching machine. He had gotten the huge chair shifted around, and by lifting the seat height with folded skins, he could hunch over the table, close facing the old Chinko who, in the picture, fawned in an agony of politeness as he taught. Mastering the alphabet in English was quite a trick, but mastering it in Cyclo was even worse. Far, far easier to trail game by its signs and know, almost to the minute, how long ago it had passed and what it was doing. These signs and symbols were fixed, deathless on a screen, and the meanings that they gave were unbelievably complex. In a week, he thought he had it. He had begun to hope. He had even commenced to believe that it was easy.
B is for bats. Z is for zoo. H is for hats. And Y is for you.
And by going over the same text in Cyclo, the bats, zoos, hats, and U's became, a little incomprehensibly, pens, shovels, kerbango, and females. But when he finally grasped, under the Chinko's groveling tutelage, that Cyclo words for hats, zoos, and bats would start with different letters, He knew he had it. He at length could lie back and rattle off the alphabet in English. Then he could, with a bit of squinting, sit up and rattle off the Cyclo alphabet in Cyclo, and with all the different nuances of how they sounded. Johnny knew he mustn't take too long at this. The diet of raw meat would eventually do him in. He was close to semi-starvation, since he could barely bring himself to eat it. The monster would come and watch him a little while each day. While he was there, Johnny was silent. He knew he must sound funny while he drilled, and the monster's laughter made the back of his hair stand up. So he would be very quiet under that scrutiny from outside the cage. It was a mistake. The monster's eye bones behind the breathe mask plate were coming closer and closer together with a growing frown. The triumph of the alphabet was short-lived. At the end of it, the monster, one beautiful bright day, yanked open the door of the cage and came roaring in like a storm. It yelled at Johnny for minutes on end, the cage bars shaking. Johnny expected a cuff, but he didn't cringe when the monster's paw snaked out. But it was reaching for the machine, not Johnny. It yanked the lever down into a second stage that Johnny had never suspected. A whole new set of pictures and sounds leaped out. The old Chinko said, in English,
I am sorry, honored student, and forgive my arrogance, but we will now begin the drill of progressive cross-association of objects, symbols, and words.
And there was a new sequence of pictures.
H.
The sound for H, the picture of H, began to follow one another at a slow interval. Then the Cyclo letter that had an H-like sound began to repeat, in sound and picture. And then they went faster and faster until they were an almost indistinguishable blur. Johnny was so astonished he did not realize the monster had left. Here was a new thing. The lever was so big and resistive he had not realized that all this lurked just beyond another thrust of pressure. Well, if a little push down would do that, what happened with a little push up? He tried it. It almost blew his head off. It took him quite a space of travel of the sun-made bar shadows to get brave enough to try it again. Same thing. It almost knocked him off the chair. Holding back, he stared at the thing suspiciously. What was it that came out of it? Sunlight? He tried it again and let it hit his hand. Warm. Tingling. Carefully staying off to the side, he saw that pictures were appearing in the frames, and he heard in the weirdest way, sort of with his head, not his ears.
Beneath the level of your consciousness, the alphabet will now go in A, B, C.
What was this? Was he hearing through his hand? No, that couldn't be. He wasn't hearing at all except for that meadowlark. Soundless somethings were coming from the machine. He moved a little further back. The impression was less. He moved closer. He felt that his brains were frying.
Now we will do the same sounds in Cyclo.
Johnny went over to the furthest extension of his chain and sat down against the wall. He thought and thought about it. He grasped at last that the cross-association drill of symbols, sounds, and words was to get him very fast and then faster and faster, so he did not have to grope for what he had been taught, but would be able to use it without hesitation. But this shaft of sunlight coming out of the machine? He got braver. He went back and found a disc that must be very advanced and put it on. Bracing himself, he grimly pushed the lever all the way up. Suddenly, he knew that if all three sides of a triangle were equal, all its enclosed three angles were also equal. He backed up. Never mind what a triangle was or an angle, he now knew. He went back and sat down against the wall. Suddenly, he reached out with his finger and drew in the dust a three-pointed shape. He poked a finger at each inside bend. He said, wonderingly,
"They're equal."
Equal what? Equal each other. So what? Maybe it was valuable. Johnny gazed at the machine. It could teach him in the ordinary way. It could teach him by speeding the lesson up. And it could teach him very smoothly and instantly with a beam of sunlight. Abruptly, an unholy joy began to light his face. Alphabet? He had to learn the whole civilization of the Cyclos. Did that monster realize why he wanted it? Life became a long parade of discs, stacks of discs. Every hour not needed for sleep was spent at the table, with straight picture learning, with progressively speeding cross-association, with the piercing beams of sunlight. Half-starved, his sleep was restless. Nightmares of dead cyclos were intertwined with raw rats chasing mechanical horses that flew. And the discs went round and round. But Johnny kept on cramming years of education into weeks and months. There was so much to know. He had to grasp it all. And with only one goal in mind, vengeance for the destruction of his race. Could he learn enough, fast enough, to accomplish his purpose?
I need to speak with my agent.
Part 2, Chapter 8. Turl had felt smug right up to the moment he received the summons from the planetary director. He was nervous now, waiting for the appointment to occur. The weeks had fled on, the summer fading into the chill of autumn. The man-animal was doing well. Its every waking moment seemed to be spent crowded up against the Chinko language and technical instruction machine. It hadn't begun to talk yet, but of course it was just an animal and stupid. It hadn't even grasped the principle of progressive speed cross-association until it had been shown. And it didn't even have enough sense to stand squarely in front of the instantaneous conceptual knowledge transmitter. Didn't it realize you had to get the full wave impulse to get it through your skull bones? Stupid. It would take months at this rate to get an education. But what could you expect of an animal that lived on raw rat? Still, sometimes when he went in the cage, Turl had looked into those strange blue eyes and had seen danger. No matter. Turl had decided that if the animal proved dangerous, he could simply use it to get things started, and then at the first sign it was getting out of hand, it could be vaporized fast enough. One button push on a hand blaster. Zip bang. No man-animal. Very easily handled. Yes, things had been going very well, until this summons. Such things made one nervous. There was no telling what the planetary director might have found out, no telling what tales some employee might have carried to him. A security chief was ordinarily not much consulted. In fact, by a devious chain of command, a security chief was not directly under the planetary director on all points. This made Turl feel better. In fact, there had been cases where a security chief had removed a planetary director, cases involving corruption. But still, the planetary director remained the administrative head and was the one who filed reports. Reports that could transfer one, or continue one on post. The summons had come late the night before, and Turl had not slept very well. He had tumbled around in his bed, imagining conversations. At one time, he had actually gotten up and combed through his office files, wondering what he had on the planetary director, just in case. That he couldn't recall or find anything depressed him. Turl only felt operational when he had big leverage in terms of potential blackmail. It was almost with relief that he saw the appointment time arrive, and he rumbled into the office of the top Cyclo. Numph, planetary director of Earth, was old. Rumor had it that he was a discard from the Central Company Directorate. Not for corruption, but just for bumbling incompetence. And he had been sent as far away as they could send him. An unimportant post, a rim star in a remote galaxy. A perfect place to send someone and forget him. Numph was sitting at his upholstered desk, looking out through the pressure dome at the distant transshipment center. He was gnawing absently on a corner of a file folder. Turl approached watchfully. Numph's executive uniform was neat. His fur, turning blue, was impeccably combed and in place. He didn't look particularly upset, though his amber eyes were introverted. Numph didn't look up.
"Sit down,"
he said absently.
"I come in response to your summons, your planetship."
The old Cyclo turned to his desk. He looked wearily at Turl.
That's obvious."
He didn't much care for Turl, but he didn't dislike him either. It was the same with all these executives. Definitely not first team. Not like the old days. Other planets, other posts, better staffs.
"We're not showing a profit,"
said Numph. He threw the folder down on his desk. 2 Kerbango saucepans rattled, but he did not offer any.
"I should imagine this planet is getting mined out."
"That's not it. There's plenty of deep-down ore to keep us going for centuries. Besides, that's the concern of the engineers, not security."
Turl didn't care to feel rebuked.
"I've heard that there's an economic depression in a lot of the company's markets. That prices are down."
"That could be. But that's the concern of the economics department at the Home Office, not security."
This second rebuke made Turl a bit restless. His chair groaned alarmingly under his bulk. Numph pulled the folder to him and fiddled with it. Then he looked wearily at Turl.
"It's costs,"
said Numph.
"Costs,"
said Turl, getting his own back a bit.
"Has to do with accounting, not security."
Numph looked at him for several seconds. He couldn't make up his mind whether Turl was being insolent. He decided to ignore it. He threw the folder back down.
"Mutiny is."
Turl stiffened.
"Where's the mutiny?"
Not the slightest rumor of it had reached him. What was going on here? Did Numph have his own intelligence system that bypassed Turl?
"It hasn't occurred. Yet. But when I announce the pay cuts and drop all bonuses, there's liable to be one."
Turl shuddered and leaned forward. This affected him in more ways than one. Numph tossed the folder at him.
"Personnel costs. We have 3,719 employees on this planet, scattered over 5